Bon dia, good morning, buenos días, welcome, benvinguts tots, benvinguts a la Casa dels Arquitectes i de l'Arquitectura aquí a Barcelona, al Col·legi d'Arquitectes de Catalunya. Seré molt breu fent aquesta presentació perquè segur que tots el que voleu ja és entrar en matèria, és un dia, però serà un dia molt intens, per tant només un comentari, el de sempre i un d'afegit. El de sempre, que segurament és avorrit perquè el faig sempre igual que sempre faig la mateixa benvinguda a la Casa dels Arquitectes. Proposar-vos ser conscients i agrair l'esforç que hi ha darrere d'aquestes iniciatives. Sempre dic el mateix, però és que crec que és pertinent aquestes iniciatives, aquests esforços, en aquest cas el que avui ens porta aquí, de vegades poden tenir més o menys valor. Em sembla que la d'avui té un valor espectacular, és a dir, segur que és d'aquelles coses de les que ens en sentim orgullosos i que quants anys a més podrem dir que a més tenim una llarga trajectòria com els cursets, per tant és d'aquelles coses que tenen molt de valor en si mateix, però que a més corresponen a una acció de voluntarisme, de sacrifici i de ganes, de societat civil, allò que fem per ajudar-nos els uns als altres. Des d'aquest punt de vista, crec que és bo començar l'acte, allò que diuen en castellà, que és de bien nacidos ser agradecidos, em sembla que és bo començar aquests actes reconeixent aquesta tasca de l'equip que ho fa possible i que ens permet disfrutar d'aquesta oportunitat. I un segon comentari que és també felicitar-vos pel que crec que és un encert modestament i sense pertànyer a la vostra, o sigui, tenir la competència específica en patrimoni, però crec que és un gran encert haver situat en el focus als Estats Units. Situar el focus als Estats Units, per descomptat, que en si mateix té sentit, però a més, posant el focus sobre un país, en aquest cas als Estats Units, no només el poses sobre un lloc, sinó també l'estàs posant sobre un temps. Hi ha països que ens donen un rang de temps més llarg. Els Estats Units ens donen un rang de temps i per tant ens situen en un tipus de problema que és el que a dia d'avui més clarament hem d'afrontar. Segurament tots tenim bastant clar els instruments, les maneres d'actuar i a més hem fet molta feina en patrimonis arquitectònics més antics. Però els patrimonis arquitectònics més recents són allò que avui ens preocupa, em sembla, a tots. No tenim ni una bona capacitat de registrar, d'inventariar, de tenir-los contemplats, però sobretot tampoc tenim, segurament, i permeteu que ho digui amb aquesta claredat, el discurs acadèmic i conceptual necessari per saber què hem d'inventariar, què hem de considerar valors i com poder-hi actuar. I a més, no només hi ha una dificultat de falta de perspectiva, que a tots ens incomoda, perquè són processos, són actuacions en les quals la perspectiva et dona un rigor, et permet un rigor que dona seguretat i que per tant facilita l'actuació professional. La falta de perspectiva a tots ens genera una certa incomoditat perquè no pots acreditar l'objectivitat de la mateixa manera, però no és només aquest problema de falta de perspectiva. Sobretot, des del meu punt de vista, el problema és de diferència de volum. Quan actuem sobre peces aïllades, molt petites, està clar que no alterem la capacitat de la ciutat per transformar-se, perquè catalogar o no catalogar una finca no altera significativament, perquè és un 0,000 del patrimoni, per tant, és una decisió que es pot prendre sobretot pensant només en l'objecte, o en tot cas en l'objecte i el seu paisatge urbà proper. Quan parlem del patrimoni arquitectònic més recent, per la seva quantitat i en funció dels criteris que s'adoptessin, sí que és rellevant a l'hora de pensar si té una interacció amb la capacitat de transformar el nostre teixit, si l'accelera, el retarda o no hi altera. Crec que això és un tema absolutament contemporani i, per tant, haver posat com a exemple Estats Units i, per tant, accions que també inclouen aquest patrimoni que per nosaltres en alguns casos pot ser clar però pot ser recent, jo crec que ens ajudarà a tots a anar construint aquest criteri per preparar unes fórmules d'actuació que ens permetin ser eficients en aquest repte. Per tant, moltíssimes gràcies. Director General d'Arxius, Museus i Patrimoni, segur que no ho he dit bé, Josep Boia. Ramon Calonja, moltíssimes gràcies per acompanyar-nos aquí i tens la paraula. Té la paraula el director general.
Bon dia, buenos días, good morning. Estimat degà, membres de la DIPA, subdirectora de Patrimoni, equip de la Direcció General que avui està amb una nodrida representació, senyores i senyors. En primer lloc, en nom del conseller de Cultura, vull donar-vos les gràcies un any més per comptar amb nosaltres, amb l'organització d'aquesta tercera bienal, amb el premi corresponent, del qual, certament, el nivell de reconeixement als projectes presentats, el que em sembla també que hem de posar molt en valor és aquest seminari amb el qual l'acompanyem, perquè jo crec que això és el que té més importància, el fet de crear espais de debat, espais de reflexió, de contrastació sobre les diverses visions que hi ha a l'entorn del patrimoni. Ahir mateix estava a Girona amb un acte organitzat per la Universitat de Girona sobre el tema de repensar el paisatge des de la perspectiva del paisatge cultural. I avui anem a parlar també de patrimoni més enllà del que ha estat el camp, la manera tradicional d'entendre el patrimoni. Perquè aquesta és, almenys en el nostre país, la gran transformació, el gran repte que se'ns posa. El contingut del camp semàntic amb el que simplement és el patrimoni ha explosionat. Ha explosionat fins al punt que podríem dir que vivim una autèntica bulímia del patrimoni. Aquí cal molt a reflexionar. El perquè d'una societat que es llança d'una manera tan compulsiva a la necessitat de conservar-ho tot. I el repte que això li posa a la mateixa societat i, en última instància, als representants de les administracions públiques, als gestors del bé comú, de tenir que donar resposta, de tenir que fer front a aquesta veritable bulímia del patrimoni cultural. De vegades aquesta bulímia ve generada per processos d'identitat local, de vegades ve generada també per un treball de reflexió epistemològica dels propis sectors professionals més vinculats al patrimoni, que se n'adonen que certament hi ha espais, aspectes d'aquest patrimoni que no han tingut un tractament. En el cas del nostre país és evident que tota l'arquitectura de la segona meitat del segle XX, de principis del segle XXI, està encara necessitada d'una estratègia nacional amb el sentit d'identificar allò que té un valor, allò que val la pena de ser protegit, i no únicament protegit, sinó també donat a conèixer al conjunt de la ciutadania, al conjunt del món. Per tant, en aquest sentit, aquesta bulímia del patrimoni, aquest continu reqüestionament dels límits del patrimoni és un element imprescindible, és un element necessari, i probablement aquesta confrontació, aquest diàleg amb les experiències d'altres països, com en el cas que ens ocuparà avui dels Estats Units, pot ser molt interessant. Deia també que, a part d'un canvi conceptual, el patrimoni també han canviat els usos del patrimoni. És a dir, uns usos inicials molt associats a la idea de nació, a la idea d'identitat nacional, a la idea d'educació popular, el patrimoni s'ha situat amb uns altres nivells, uns altres usos. El patrimoni avui en dia és un factor de desenvolupament local, és un desenvolupament econòmic. Si no penseu el pes que el patrimoni juga amb la promoció turística, amb la venda turística de la ciutat de Barcelona. Amb totes les conseqüències que això també comporta, no pensem únicament en Barcelona, pensem també en ciutats com Venècia, en casos que aquest èxit és tan gran que posa en perill la pròpia supervivència del patrimoni. Han canviat també els mètodes de treball sobre aquest patrimoni, tant en el sentit dels mètodes tècnics com les maneres conceptuals d'apropar-se als processos d'identificació, de conservació, de restauració i de posada en valor d'aquest patrimoni. I finalment també, i això em sembla una de les dades més rellevants, han canviat també els actors. Durant molt de temps, la construcció del patrimoni, perquè estem parlant d'una construcció social, el patrimoni en si no existeix, no hi ha cap bé, cap entitat patrimonial que en si mateixa porti la qualitat de patrimoni. El patrimoni és una mirada que en un temps i en un lloc donat una societat fa que diu que allò mereix de ser conservat. amb aquest procés d'identificació i amb aquest procés de decisió de conservació, durant un temps els actors han estat els sectors de l'acadèmia. Quan dic l'acadèmia em refereixo tant al món de les universitats, al propi col·lectiu, per exemple, dels arquitectes. Això ha canviat. Aquí tenim un nou actor, que és la pròpia ciutadania. Cada vegada més reclama aquest dret de ser una part important en els processos de decisió d'allò que mereix ser conservat. I això, com a representant d'un govern, d'una administració pública, és una dimensió que no podem ignorar més. En aquest sentit, també, l'experiència americana, un país en què aquest pes de la ciutadania, aquest pes de la societat civil amb els processos d'identificació i de conservació del patrimoni tenen un pes molt més gran que el que seria l'univers europeu i no cal dir català, penso que serà interessant de confrontar-ho i veure què en podem aprendre en el sentit de desenvolupar noves estratègies o senzillament de reforçar-nos amb el bon criteri o amb la bona opció que hem fet en relació a les que nosaltres estem implementant. Ahir també a la gestió a la sessió de Girona, quan es parlava del patrimoni, es van dir dues coses molt boniques. D'una banda es va dir que el patrimoni senzillament és allò que una societat necessita per continuar vivint. Des d'aquest punt de vista hem d'acceptar una dimensió de mort del patrimoni. Hi ha un patrimoni que no és possible conservar i que és normal que mori. En aquest sentit, ho dic perquè últimament el nostre país viu molt sobre la situació d'alarma. Un bon dia hi ha els llibres del Benet i Jornet que apareixen en un container. El dia següent apareix a la premsa que es venen els mobles del Palau Moixó. I tot això crea una sensació d'angoixa. Hem d'acceptar que hi ha una certa necessitat també de que amb aquest procés d'identificació i conservació, la desaparició, la mort del patrimoni, també hi té un sentit, perquè justament és això el patrimoni, és que la vida continuï. I aquesta és la segona dimensió. Parlar de patrimoni no és parlar de passat, és parlar de futur. És preparar el futur. És a dir, nosaltres només som un element més en una cadena de transmissió, que hem de pensar en els nostres fills, amb els nostres nets i amb els fills dels nostres nets. I aquesta és la nostra responsabilitat, sobretot les persones, els arquitectes, el món dels restauradors, el món dels museòlegs que toquem el món del patrimoni. És a dir, no treballem pel passat, no treballem per l'avui, treballem pel demà. Senzillament perquè això, com es deia també ahir a l'entrega dels Premis de Cultura, perquè la vida sense cultura és molt avorrida, la vida sense patrimoni és molt trista. És a dir, cultura i patrimoni senzillament són qualitat de vida, són felicitat. Per tant, mireu quina és la grandíssima responsabilitat que tots vosaltres, jo mateix tenim, que és contribuir a fer una societat de major qualitat de vida, de major felicitat. Moltíssimes gràcies.
Moltes gràcies, director general. Degà, bon dia a tothom, good morning. Primer de tot dir que per nosaltres, pels directors que organitzem el Premi i aquesta Bienal, és un gran honor estar aquí un any més, una edició més, i poder compartir i poder-vos oferir aquesta jornada. Ara? Sí? Ells agraïen als organitzadors, clar, jo no puc fer una altra cosa que agrair al Departament de Cultura la confiança que ha posat en nosaltres, al col·legi especialment i al degà i a l'equip directiu, diguem-ho així, que ha posat la confiança durant no menys de 6 anys, perquè clar, estem parlant de 3 edicions, però com que són bianuals, doncs estem parlant d'un llarg recorregut. Jo crec que érem bastant més joves quan vam començar amb això, ja fa a vora gairebé 10 anys que vam començar a parlar del premi amb els organitzadors. Molt agraïts de totes les paraules de recolzament i tot això, però dir-li al degà que això de comparar el premi amb el curset, és que ens quedem molt petits, perquè si el curset d'enguany és la 40a edició, faig una pausa, 40a edició, Clar, jo m'imagino, la 40a edició del Premi serien 80 anys, o sigui, no m'ho vull ni imaginar, Dit això, convideu-vos a tots a l'assistència d'aquest curset, que segur que serà molt interessant, que el conduirà la senyora Mireia Bernades, que està aquí present, i que també serà de molt d'interès. Dir-vos que per nosaltres és també uns dies de molt d'estrès, però també disfrutem molt de les jornades de lliurament, i ahir amb el jurat que vam estar acabant de deliberar a la sala quins eren els guanyadors, que ja els sabem, però ja els sabreu més tard, i que són unes jornades que per nosaltres són molt entranyables, i ens agrada molt compartir amb tots i tota aquesta bonomia que genera el premi. Dius sobre la Bienal que ara el senyor Carsten Hansen us explicarà una mica quin serà el contingut de la jornada d'avui, i també explicar amb una certa humilitat que això de l'elecció dels Estats Units va sorgir que aquest senyor, el Jordi Portal, i el senyor Carsten van coincidir amb unes jornades de l'AIA, que és l'American Institute of Architects, i van dir, escolta tu, i si poguéssim convidar als Estats Units, i escolta, però això no sé com ho muntarem, no? I escolta, jo tinc el contacte, no sé què, i vam començar a organitzar. Llavors volíem acabar de fer rodonida aquesta jornada, i vaig dir, escolta, jo podria mirar de trucar al senyor Freixa, en Jaume Freixa, que és el que havia col·laborat amb CERT, i ho podríem lligar tot una mica. En la primera reunió que tenim amb en Jaume Freixa, que està aquí i que és ponent d'aquesta tarda, li vam estar explicant una mica tot el projecte del Premi i de la Bienal i tot plegat, i ens va dir, escolta tu, això penso que és una bona idea, que ho esteu fent bé, que incidir sobre les intervencions, sobre allò construït, ara és el que toca, perquè no estarem gastant sol infinitament, diguéssim, tot això és finit, i per tant, diguéssim, posar l'accent en aquestes coses, i sobretot amb la intervenció del patrimoni, una mica era el que tocava. Res més, dius que el senyor Carsten ara us explicarà una mica tot el que és la jornada, que disfruteu molt i que nosaltres ho hem fet amb molta il·lusió, i moltíssimes gràcies per venir a tothom. Gràcies.
Well, good morning to all of you. Welcome to this event, and I'd like to thank also the DIPA, the Order of Architects, and the Generalitat to be able to have me here today, participate in this event. And I would I highlighted one remark of Joseph Boya just before, what I think I found very important. He reminded us that actually heritage is not just about the past, it's about the future. And I think this prize, DIPA, also shows that, because we want to highlight good practices, and so it shows us that this is actually about preparing good ways of working on heritage for the future. Like Ramon said, this guest presentation of the United States at this Biennale all started out last April when, as the AIA European chapter, we had a conference here in Barcelona organized by Sofia Goodis, who is here with us today. And we had a chance to have Jordi Portal speaking about the prize. And then we said, like, how can we find a way of including the US at this prize, and how should we get into contact with the right people to speak about how heritage is approached in the United States. As the 2017 Vice President of our chapter, I approached then people on our board, at our board meeting in January, and we start talking about how should we find the right people in the United States to talk about this. Then, of course, we said we need somebody in the academic field, we need a practitioner, and that is something I will talk later on about when I will give you a presentation of what is AIA Europe. And it's a terrific, great network of people, which then through this network I came into contact with people in Chicago, and through Gurney Harbor I met David Fixler and William Dupont, who are here with us today, and will introduce a topic where we will talk about how heritage is approached in the United States. So the first speaker of today will be William Dupont. So William is a honorary fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He's a San Antonio Conservation Society endowed professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio. He directs the University Center for Cultural Sustainability to convene researchers and students on sponsored projects, expand the relevance of heritage as a significant element in sustainable design, and promote design with respect for the cultural continuity of local populations. Professor William Dupont established the University of Texas Graduate Certification Program in Historic Preservation, and he teaches architecture design studios and seminars concerning various historic topics. On behalf of the Finca Vigia Foundation, he has led the United States technical team supporting Cuban preservation efforts at the Museo Ernest Hemingway in Havana ever since 2005. And prior to joining the University of Texas, William Dupont served 11 years as a chief architect at the National Trust Historic Sites organization, which is the main organization in the United States, the government body that takes care of historic preservation, and he will explain us how that works. And he continuously assists this organization as a member of the advisory council for the Villa Finale Historic Site in San Antonio. Recently, he worked with his students on a comparative analysis chapter for the report that helped to inscribe the San Antonio mission as a UNESCO Historic Heritage Site. So, William, I'll leave the mic to you.
Okay. All right. I'm glad you're all here today, and I'll try and explain some of the things that I was asked to address. and the title of The Notion of Architectural Heritage in the U.S. and its Intervention Criteria. It's obviously a very large topic, and we could talk about it for a very long time, but I'll try to keep my remarks somewhat focused and pick and choose on some good topics. And I appreciate dialogue, so if you have a question and wish to interrupt me, something that you don't understand, I'd be happy to respond. So the overview of the presentation today will deal with the designation of cultural property, the legal protections for cultural property, some of the ideas of why we preserve, what are the benefits of a tangible past, and then I want to talk about recent transformation that we have in our motivations for heritage conservation, because I think our field of historic preservation and our job as architects is changing, and I want to discuss that with you. And last point will be regarding education of future leaders, which is what I view as my role as a professor of architecture at my university. I expect all of the students who graduate from our programs to be capable of leading projects in architecture and historic preservation later in their careers. So we'll talk about that education. So a little bit, let's see. What is cultural property? We must start with that. I presume everyone in the room has their own definition of what is cultural property, and if we were all to compare notes, we would get some agreement, but we might also find there are some differences. But when I speak of it, I'm talking about the tangible remains of heritage. So we have objects, buildings, landscapes, and districts, and each may require a different approach to the preservation. Being an architect, I don't speak much about the objects, and today I will focus mostly on buildings and not about landscapes or even about historic districts very much. The domain of conservation of objects I view as a somewhat separate discipline than architecture and buildings. So U.S. terminology, just a brief note. When we use the word historic preservation, it means the same as heritage conservation in the U.S. We can debate that and talk about the terminology, but we won't. And conserve equals preserve. Obviously, these are different words with different definitions, but for the purpose of today's lecture, they're interchangeable. So when I worked as the chief architect for the National Trust, I had the great honor and privilege to work on a number of architectural masterpieces, and I'll show you some of those right now to give you a sense of my context and the work that I've been involved in, and start to introduce some of these topics through them. So you all know the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. He had a home and studio in Oak Park. It is a National Trust historic site. It is restored, and we'll talk about the definition of restoration quite specifically, restored to a 1909 appearance. That restoration, of course, required undoing work that Wright himself had done or specified as an architect. So some of the master's own work was reversed in order to restore it to a 1909 appearance. And the Roby House, which the restoration is now complete, to a 1910 appearance. And it required a lot of radical changes because the building had undergone many different uses over the years to have it appear now as a museum for the design by Frank Lloyd Wright. How many in the room have been to Chicago? Several, that's good. We'll also talk about the Farnsworth House, which is in Plano, Illinois. Did you make it out to Plano? Several did? Not as many. It's about an hour away from Chicago. Well, next time you go to Chicago, or if you go, get to the Farnsworth House too. It's a delight. As is Philip Johnson's Glass House. Many may debate whether Philip Johnson belongs in the same pantheon of architects as Mies van der Rohe but he clearly did some fabulous masterpieces, and the Glass House is one of them. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth about those, but each of them required a process of documentation and assessment and designation, establishing historical significance, understanding why the buildings have certain problems that may need to be addressed, and transformations to set them on their future path to be properties open to the public. In the case of Johnson's Glass House, from a private residence to a public site with the Farnsworth House, Lord Peter Palumbo had already made some transformations to open it up to the public. And then, while I was at the National Trust, the Pueblo of Acoma also became a National Trust site. How many have been to New Mexico and any of the pueblos there? One. Amazing. Congratulations. So, a future trip for some. They're wonderful sites, sublime, and this particular area, which is called Sky City, it's an area atop a mesa, and it has a Spanish colonial mission there, and a very long history of living on top of this mesa, stretching back about 1,000 years. And the practice of heritage conservation at Acoma is one that focuses on traditions and beliefs and oral history. It's a community that does not wish to record its own history in a documented way. They don't want to be photographed. They don't wish to be drawn. They don't wish to be recorded. They don't record recipes for food in a written manner. They don't use measures when they cook in traditional ways. And so it's a very difficult thing for me and for others who were trained in academia to understand this method of heritage conservation, because it focuses on the core, the essence of what the culture is about, and not about the details of whether or not a door is made of wood or aluminum, or whether we're allowed to park our car next to the historic resource or not. And so it's a dynamic community. It's one that has a heritage that continues to change. And if you go there, they've been doing tours there for over 100 years. And if you visit, and then you visit again, because it's an oral tradition, you may hear the same story a different way twice. And that's okay, I believe. But many go and say, I have a problem with oral history because the story changes. And to me, I say, well, that's their culture, that's their heritage. The core of the story, the essence of it, carries forward. The community is changing, and they don't put a big emphasis on material conservation so much as they do on preservation of their language and their beliefs and their way of life. So here in 1934, when the Pueblo had insufficient power to protect itself from being photographed, the U.S. government did a documentation, the Historic American Building Survey, and made photographs and a full record of drawings of the entire Sky City without permission. And it hasn't changed a whole lot. There we go. A shot that I took in 2007. And they do allow photography with a permit, but only of certain things. There's some things they say you can't photograph and other things they say you can. And so you can see that they've maintained a lot of things, but you also can start to notice little differences. So it's not a preservation of the sort that's typically practiced in the U.S. And this is me and some students in 2008, where we got to work with high school students on the care of an ancient stair. And it was not any sort of a preservation activity that I would typically get engaged in on a project that I would do as a professional or as an academic. but it was very respectful and a lot of fun. And it was mostly just to take care of the stair so that it was still functional, because the stairs are the traditional routes up and down to the top of the mesa. There's now a road, which was put in for a movie in the 1930s. Another project I've worked on is the President Lincoln Cottage National Monument that has an interpretive period to the time of President Lincoln's presidency, as you might expect. There were actually 5 U.S. presidents that resided at this particular cottage on the grounds of a soldier's home in Washington, D.C. And it's the third highest point in Washington, and it looks right down North Capitol Street to the dome of the U.S. Capitol. It's a lovely place, and Lincoln used it as a sanctuary, as a retreat. And it's been restored, and we'll talk about restoration. I think restoration now has become a thing that's probably mostly in our past in terms of what we practice as architects. It's a technique of dealing with heritage that I think is very limiting. And it's while I'm perfectly proud of the work that was accomplished at the Lincoln Cottage, I don't know that I would do it the same way if I were engaged in the process again now. And the work at Finca Bahia, which is Ernest Hemingway's home of 22 years in Havana, has been very informative in my way of thinking, because the Cubans have a wonderful habit of introducing all meetings with discussion about why we're all there and what are the values of the place and why we are doing anything with Hemingway's legacy and what's important about it. So we may meet once, twice, sometimes 3 times in a year to talk about things, and I'm there only in an advisory capacity for the most part. And in those discussions, we always revisit why we're doing it and what's important, why it's relevant. And I think sometimes we forget, as we get caught up in the details of what we're doing, to talk about why things are relevant, why it matters that we conserve heritage. So the Venice Charter is obviously very influential. I presume most of you in the room, if not all, are familiar with the Venice Charter, but we'll revisit it for a moment, because to explain how things work in the US, you have to explain the Venice Charter, because our primary preservation law, which was written in 1966, is in very much large degree based on the Venice Charter. And so in the Venice Charter, we have these principles of common heritage, common responsibility to safeguard the heritage, the idea that you have to establish a historic significance in advance of doing any sort of a treatment, the concept of integrity, that being the capacity of a place to convey its significance, and the idea that the treatments must not diminish that integrity. So once you've established why something's important, and you know that it's correct in its context, it has a high degree of surviving materials, and other aspects of integrity, such as setting and spirituality, and then you move forward trying not to hurt that integrity, but rather enhance it. So the Venice Charter has within it, and in the practice of architecture, we have seen evolve certain preservation principles. And while there may be a large disagreement on the notion of historic preservation as a concept, and many in the US who think it just gets in the way and is a problem, and people who do it should be pushed aside, and the developers who are going to build new buildings should be given free rein. But those who practice do abide by these principles, that we should not do any harm. Things should be, to a large degree, reversible when we can do it. We should be honest. Document, follow good archival practices, have rigorous scholarship, appropriate research methods, that our interventions should be legible so that we can read them. Going beyond things that are in the Venice Charter, the idea that stakeholders should be included, that comes to us from the Australian Borough Charter. Concepts of sustainability and longevity. Of course, routine and cyclical maintenance. It's very important. Fiduciary responsibility and thinking about the capacity of the owner is a principle in our work. And then, very important, authenticity must be respected and the integrity must be retained. So we'll talk a little bit more about authenticity, but let's go through some of these articles from the Venice Charter about historic monuments, not just single architectural work, but things that are all-encompassing, not just the great works. Conservation treatment, and here Venice uses the word conservation, in the US we use the word preservation. Permanent maintenance, appropriate and useful purpose, retain the setting, that's part of the integrity. Do not alter the mass and color by new construction or demolition. A monument is inseparable from the history to which it bears witness and the setting in which it occurs. So these are all elements of the preservation treatment that's in our Secretary of the Interior standards. A restoration treatment, and here the Lincoln Cottage as example, an aim to preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historic value of the monument, respect for original material and authentic documents. And the important thing about restoration is that it must stop where conjecture begins. No speculation. And as I said earlier, I think restoration is too limiting and something that should be done less and less. But it is still a valid treatment, and there are times when it's appropriate. More about restoration. Valid contributions of all period must be respected, since unity of style is not the aim of a restoration. Evaluation of the importance and the decision as to what may be destroyed cannot rest solely on the individual in charge of the work. So that brings up the idea that we need to have advisory support. So when I work on projects of great significance, I try not to do it alone. I bring in people from other areas of practice and specialists from other parts of the country and gather them to discuss ideas. And that's a role that I play for my colleagues in Cuba when we talk about Museo Hemingway and the Finca Vejía work. Restoration can only be justified in exceptional circumstances, and what is removed is of little interest, and the material which is brought to light is of great historical and archaeological or aesthetic value. I think this is the principle that we may have forgotten in our rush to restore things, because it's fun to restore things. Has anyone ever worked on a restoration project? It's delightful to dig in and uncover the past and find all the physical evidence and find the documentary evidence and say, I can assure you it was exactly like this. We can tell you what President Lincoln would have seen if he stood right here. We can restore that view from that particular day and time. And there are exceptional circumstances when it's appropriate, but not many. So we have these guidelines in the US. This is our core document that we use. We refer to them as the standards. These are promulgated by the US Department of the Interior. Thus, they're often called the Secretary of the Interior standards. And while secretaries may come and go with presidential administrations, these are the standards that we've had since 1995. They're currently up for some revision. They're part of the National Park Service that does this, and they're applied to all properties that are on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is our primary system of designating properties. So they address maintenance, repair, replacement of historic materials. They give us guidance on additions or alterations. The compliance with the standards is required by federal funding or any federal undertaking, or if there's a federal permitting process. Local government zoning laws are what use these. Federal tax credits for private projects also require compliance with the standards. Now, you might think that properties that are designated on our National Register of Historic Places are protected. They are not. They can be demolished. They can be partially destroyed. They can be dealt with in various ways. Designation alone is not the principal criteria of protection. The only way to surely protect something is to own it. Without ownership, you use the ordinances at local level. In cities like San Antonio, where I live, we have a review commission. It's called the Historic and Design Review Commission. They are the ones, and the city council, that have the power to actually block a demolition or see that a change is appropriate. And appropriate is the legal term that shows up in the zoning ordinances, because that's the measure of what something is considered okay and going to be allowed. Is it appropriate? And so they issue a certificate of appropriateness. And the appropriateness has to do with the Secretary of the Interior standards. That's how we measure appropriateness. So what's in these standards? There's various treatments. Restoration is one. We've talked about restoration, accurately depicting at a particular period of time. An example of this, one of the great restorations, is James Madison's Montpelier. James Madison, U.S. President, author of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. He wrote them at Montpelier. And so his home was essentially dismantled stick by stick in order to find the core Madison home, because it had been so modified over the years. So this is what it looked like when I first saw it. And it's a rather large, imposing plantation house. Madison was a slave owner, and this was his plantation. This is one of the earliest photographs that show something of the context of what it was in Madison's time. And here's how it looks now. So it underwent massive surgery in order to attain this, and not just on the exterior. The interior was heavily modified. You can see in the light colors what was removed, and in the dark what remains. And in doing this, the house had been essentially gutted. And so there were just bits and pieces left from the interior. And the stairs were in the wrong places, chimneys had been moved, and all of it got put back the way it was according to the physical evidence. So then we have other treatments. We define preservation, we define rehabilitation. So preservation, which essentially is the word conservation from the Venice Charter, sustain existing form, integrity, and materials. No replacement, no new additions. Rehabilitation allows additions. That's the word that we use in our Secretary of the Interior standards to talk about compatible use through repair, alteration, and additions, to preserve character-defining features as part of it. And there's a clause in the rehabilitation standards that annoys many U.S. architects. New work should be differentiated from old. There are some architects who think, why can't the new work just blend right in and look seamless? Why isn't that how architects would do work in centuries before? Sometimes that's appropriate, but the standards do not allow it. So, now let's look carefully at case studies here and get into some interesting issues with the Farnsworth House and the Johnson House. While they may look similar in terms of being glass boxes and have a core that holds their infrastructure and no interior partitions, they are white and black, floating versus anchored, and one is very austere and the other is actually quite comfortable. Any guesses on which one? You can tell which one's white and black and which one's floating versus anchored. The austere is the Farnsworth House. It's sublime, but it's very, very precise and very straight and formal. And the Johnson House, somehow, while it looks so similar, achieves a level of comfort where you can sit in it all day long. And I've worked in both houses, and you can spend 8 hours in Johnson's house and be totally relaxed. And I think maybe that's a difference in the two architects that transferred into their work. And so it's an important thing, though, to keep in mind when doing a preservation action, a treatment on the two, to understand that they have different personalities and the work that they need may be different. So one of the things that we often forget regarding the Farnsworth house is that it did have a contextual reference. This is a fuzzy Polaroid photograph that is in the archives, and it's from when Lord Peter Palumbo purchased the house. And as far as I know, it's the only picture that shows the context. Does this have a pointer? Maybe? Yeah. The context of the railroad trestle bridge in the background. It's a through truss, painted white. And Mies van der Rohe, in seeing that, is responding to the context and enjoying that play that exists. And the house, of course, is also responding to the context of the Fox River. That's why it's floating above the plain, because it was intended at that time, or was at that time, 3 feet above the highest known flood level. No longer true. So this is Peter Palumbo at the time of purchase. Take a look at the furnishings in the background, the orientation of the wardrobe, and some of the differences in curtains. Because the house is so formal and so tight and so austere, little changes mean a lot. I think this is something that maybe David Fixler will talk about in the afternoon, that when you're working in the mid-century modern buildings, subtle adjustments can have a big impact. One of the things regarding this design is that it had screens when it was first built, and they're gone now. Palumbo believed that Mies van der Rohe didn't think the screens belonged there, and so he had them removed. They were, however, shown in the earliest model that Mies did of the house, and there was a famous court case that was excellent for U.S. architects, because Mies actually had to sue to get his full payment, his commission, from Edith Farnsworth, because the house cost, I think, $70,000, and she thought it was going to cost $50,000, and she didn't think she should pay the extra $20,000. And the court sided in favor of Mies van der Rohe, saying that what Farnsworth had received was only an estimate and not a guaranteed contract. Big win for architects, so now we can give estimates and not be held to them. So in this case, Mies van der Rohe was the general contractor as well. He oversaw the construction. And so when he submitted his records for the court proceedings, it described everything that's in there, including the wardrobe that it was said that he didn't want to have anything to do with. He sued to have payment for that, including the screens, including a little garage that doesn't look anything like Mies van der Rohe's work, but it's up on the hill, and it's in the court case. So here's what the screen looked like. And there it is today. So this brings up this idea of what were the master's intentions? What did he mean to achieve? And how we should handle this. If we were to do a period restoration of Edith Farnsworth time, it would have to look like this on the left, because that's a photograph of the way it looked when Dr. Farnsworth moved into her weekend home. And this is the way it looked now, according to the designs that Lord Peter Palumbo put into the house. He loved Mies van der Rohe's work, and he wanted very much to be as respectful as possible. So he removed everything that Farnsworth had and put in what he thought should look the best. Mies van der Rohe designed furniture, the Barcelona set. He also did other things that maybe weren't so good, like these lighting bright spots above the interior cabinets. The color of the wardrobe here at the back is lightening over the years. It's dark because it got damaged in a flood and it had to be redone. Oop, went the wrong way. So the philosophy for Mies van der Rohe, almost nothing, sometimes in English that's translated to less is more. I think almost nothing tells the story a little bit better because he was trying to reduce things down to their essential elements, and he achieved it here. In doing so, though, he didn't necessarily make a great place for living because Farnsworth wanted screens because there were bugs, and she needed windows to have ventilation through the house. When Palumbo took the screens out, in order to have the house be functional, he had to put in air conditioning. The air conditioning has caused problems. So this is Mies van der Rohe overseeing the construction. Selecting the travertine, he selected them very carefully in the manner, I suppose, that a painter would select the stroke of an oil brush on a painting. He picked each piece. Many were rejected. The archives show that many of the travertine panels that went into the house were not to his liking and were sent back. This is how it appears now, the way the National Trust displays it, consistent with how Peter Palumbo had it for 30 years, with a few minor adjustments. The travertine is cracking, and there are areas where it's displaced and it's a tripping hazard. Presently, the owner is living with these conditions because in order to get the travertine out, you'd have to destroy it. It's glued down into position. So you'd have to have a new piece, and similar to that oil painting analogy, it's as if you were going to carve out a piece of the master's oil painting and then put in a new piece of oil. So it's a very difficult choice, a decision, and nobody wants to make it. So it hasn't been done yet. But there's more problems. Because of the air conditioning, we discovered through condition assessment, the corrosion that's happening at the glass stops is going to soon break the window because of oxide jacking and the rust of the steel lifting the piece of glass to the point of shattering it. The details of construction, because Mies never made any drawings, are only guessed at, or so we thought, until we took a careful look in the Museum of Modern Art and found that there were steel shop drawings. And on the shop drawings, there are notations made about how the house is constructed from the field notes, and so it helps a lot. We don't have to just look at the global architecture series drawings, which are these ones in the background that show some of the details of how the house is assembled. But this is where the area of corrosion is happening. And so in our analysis, you see that same detail here. And the corrosion is all happening in the corners, the worst one being this corner over here on the lower left. And so in assessing all the different pieces and looking at the pattern of corrosion, and then observing how the curtains are always kept in the house, and the conditions of the HVAC running, we determined that there was a microclimate being created behind the curtains and an area of extreme condensation and water constantly dripping on the face, the inside face of the glass, which was the source of the corrosion. But nonetheless, the corrosion has started, and once the oxidation process has commenced, it's very difficult to arrest it. That's it from the inside, sweeping across the floor at that same window. In a large view, that's a slot head screw that holds the glass stop in place there. So, being the chief architect, I said, all right, well, let's at least not put the curtains in the corners anymore so that we don't have that corrosion problem still making it worse and worse. And, let's try and paint it and things. So we moved the curtains so they're not in the corner, as you can see here. Not in the corner, but we put the curtains in because they have to be somewhere. And what do we have? Condensation occurring behind the curtains. So the problem is with the HVAC, which we can't really get rid of, or can we? Maybe because the visitors are only in the house for 25, 30 minutes. Maybe on a hot day they can be hot. So it's something that has to be experimented with, because the longevity of the house is very important, and keeping it cool maybe is less important. Always a balance. So looking at Johnson's glass house, well, he didn't air condition it. And he lived in it, and he was okay with it, but Connecticut is different than Illinois. He had 4 doors, no screens, opened the doors, bugs came in, bugs went out. He didn't care. It was mostly a weekend house for Johnson, but he lived in it full time by the end of his life. This is a shot I took a week ago. It was a rainy day, very lush. It's been open for 10 years now as a historic site, operated by the National Trust. It underwent a lot of changes. One might think just a little glass cleaner is all you'd need to open a site to the public. Not the case, because of building codes, because of requirements for public use. So even though Johnson himself had an incident at the end of his life where he was in a wheelchair for approximately 9 months, I think, he didn't make the house barrier-free. I would talk to him about it in his lifetime, because he donated the property to the National Trust 3 years before he passed away. I was the architect for the National Trust. The staff that worked there, while he paid their salaries, they reported to me, which meant nothing. They really reported to him. And he didn't want to talk about barrier-free access. He would say, that's your problem. You figure it out after I'm dead. So we did. But it wasn't easy. So this is the inside of the house. Shots from 10 years ago, somewhat commingled in with shots I took last week. And one of the things I noticed, you'll see in this next set a few changes. This is the desk where his partner David Whitney sat towards the end of his life to do bills and various tasks. They didn't use it to have as a dining table anymore, but in the historical period that's discussed, the dining table was set, as you see in the slide on the upper left. So it's the same table, just a different arrangement of furniture, but it gives the house a very different look. And another little thing, there's a little potted plant here, which wasn't there 10 years ago. And the trash container appears to be different. So these are the kind of little changes that you notice in a modern house. You know, if this were a house from the late 19th century, you wouldn't even see any of that amidst the clutter of the Victorians. But it works very nicely as a house, and Johnson loved it. And in the daytime when he would take a nap, of course, he would go to the guest house, which is the brick box behind it. How many have been to this in New Canaan? Anybody made it? David, one? That's not fair because you live in Boston. So. So now here we get into the issue that's different about Johnson's glass house. Because he lived there and because he made it his own design. So he was not only the architect, but he was the client. He had the opportunity to see his buildings weather over time and the opportunity to choose how to maintain them in his lifetime. So that gave us a lesson in treating it and setting a preservation philosophy as to how we might do things. And what he would do is let things go. He actually didn't maintain things for periods of time, 15, 20, 25 years, because he liked the way it looked. And he would say that to people. And he would talk about how a building needed about 20 years to weather and look right. And he felt that way about the buildings on his property. So whether it was the glass house, the brick guest house, the pavilion in the pond, the painting gallery, the sculpture gallery, he did many projects on his estate, including this little doghouse, which is sort of an homage to Bruce Goff, I think, but I never asked him. Bruce Goff, anybody know Bruce Goff? The architectural historian, only David, right? Okay. I'm going to stop asking questions because you're the only one. It's all covered in lichen. And so eventually that's going to have to be cleaned up. But that's a historic artifact because Johnson designed it. It's a doghouse. But there it sits. And the proportions of the opening of this are an exact match to the black door of the guest house. So it belongs there. The master created it. Now, the site has been doing some interesting things. This is a Robert, Indiana installation. The sequence of numbers, very large numbers that has just been put down the hill that you walk to get down to the pavilion at the pond. And so that's a departure from the preservation philosophy of the past because this whole thing is a cultural landscape. It's not just one building. And so it's very interesting to see that they're doing this. It's going to be a one-year installation. Indiana did work with Johnson. Johnson collected art from many. Frank Gehry has a piece on Johnson's property. It's called the Ghost House. It's there and it's in good shape. So this is the whole property, at least its historic core, and it has a 19th century house, and it has the buried painting gallery, the sculpture gallery, the glass house, the guest house, a library. Gary's Ghost House is down over there. And it has the Monsta, which was intended to be a visitor center, but it doesn't really work right as a visitor center, so the visitor center is in town. Plus, the local community didn't want a visitor center because New Canaan's filled with very wealthy New Yorkers. So the sculpture gallery is the white, what Johnson called a brick barn in the background, and that mound of earth is the painting gallery. Going on time? Going well. This is the pathway to the sculpture gallery. And so here we have issues of how do we address the users, the new visitors. Johnson didn't have to worry about that as a private individual. It was his private home. He could have a party, and he didn't have to worry about barrier-free access. Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA as we call it. Disabled Americans on a private residence, it's not an issue. But when it's a public facility, then you have to accommodate people who have disabilities per our US laws. So these pathways had a cross slope that was too great. They had to be redone. There are hazards, tripping hazards on the site, areas where people could fall. This is the sculpture gallery, and as you can see, there's no railings, and so there are places all over the world where you can walk down these steps and nobody would care. But here, it's not allowed because there's no railings, and we can't put railings in because Johnson never had railings. So what we're left with is this small little fence, this little rope, and these little chrome stanchions to be as invisible as possible, to say to people, don't come to the edge. You can come in, you can look at it, you can look down and see these Chamberlain sculptures here, and is that an Irwin? I think that's a Schnabel. There's an amazing collection of art. This little one down here, it's the left side of my body. It's something that's, I think its valuation is $1.2 million. It's a bunch of little neon strips. It's beautiful. But you can't turn it on, you can't look at it. It's very unfortunate. So it's this wonderful collection that you can't gain access to because the US laws don't allow it. It's not safe. They're trying to figure out ways to get people in through another route. It also has only one means of egress, so once you get down, you're down 2 levels because the whole thing spirals down into the ground. There's only one way out, back through the top. So that's against the code too. So presently, access is minimal to this. There's the Monsta, which is the only facility on site that has a barrier-free bathroom that meets universal access, and it has a step at the front door. I don't know why Johnson put a step to the visitor center, but he did. And so it requires a ramp. There's a portable ramp that can be brought out. This is this bunker-looking structure is the entrance to this beautiful painting gallery with very large panels that rotate in this cloverleaf manner. And here you can see some of the lichen on the brownstone that Johnson thought was fabulous. He spoke of it and said, it looks beautiful. It's weathered in. So that patina is impossible to maintain over generations. It'll have to be restored, and in restoring it, you have to undo what Johnson did. And so I refer to the preservation philosophy at this site as an egg timer. And does egg timer translate well? Does anybody know what an egg timer is? When you're a kitchen timer, when you want to set the cooking. And so the timer on this is set to about 30 years. And at the end of 30 years, it's cooked, and you have to take it out and redo it. And remove the lichen, save the brownstone, and then put it back in for another 30 years. And not maintain it, because that's how Johnson did it. And those things are around the site. Including, there's something very extraordinary here. In order to walk from the main area where the glass house is out to the painting gallery and off into the distance the sculpture gallery, the route has to be entirely accessible. The slopes were set wrong. So this particular wall was documented, photographed, disassembled, reassembled to be 3 feet longer with a few new stones, and then the slope was appropriate for the barrier-free access so that we didn't have to put permanent handrails in. The code, when you consider the building to be an arboretum and in the outdoor landscape, for some reason, the Connecticut state architect who had the review authority over this, thankfully, agreed that it would threaten or destroy the historic resource, which is the legal term that we use when we're looking for a code relief, threaten or destroy this historic resource to put handrails over this little eyebrow bridge, which I'll show you better here. So this is how it looks last week when I was there in the rain. And this path is the barrier-free access route, which never existed before. That had to be put into Johnson's landscape. So it's an intervention, but it's done in a way so that it's hidden as you're in the glass house looking up the sweep of the hill. And you can see that with the tall grass, and you can imagine if you're down here and looking up the hill, you can't see the walkway. And it works, which is good. And this little eyebrow bridge, I don't know if you can see it from where you're seated, but we had to add little curbs, they're called. And the curb is for individuals who are in wheeled, like a wheelchair, things with wheels, or a walker, or a person who has a visual impairment and uses a cane to find the edge of where they walk. And so that curb is necessary for that building code requirement. But in order to do this, Johnson, it was even trickier. Johnson had a philosophy that he called safe danger. So we had to respect that value of safe danger. And the safe danger concept is that he liked you to be in a place where you would have a feeling of danger, but you also felt safe at the same time. And the eyebrow bridge is one of the things that achieves that, because there's no railing and it has a bounce. And as you move across it, you can feel it bouncing. And if we had put curbs in that were welded to the steel, that would have structurally stiffened it and diminished the bounce that the designer intended. So in order to keep the bounce, which is part of the feeling of the place, these curbs are only friction fit in between the wood and the steel. They're not attached in any way. So they add a little dead weight, but not much. They're just plywood painted black. Barrier-free access at the house requires a ramp. It sits in storage in the guest house. It can be assembled in under 20 minutes. They have used it. It works. I asked last week, that was one of the reasons why I went back. I said, does that ramp we designed actually work? Or has that ever happened where you had to use it? And they said, yes, the staff doesn't like assembling it, but it can be done. And because of the way the tours work, they're advance tickets, and you arrive by first at the visitor center in the town of New Canaan, and you show up at the site approximately 30 minutes later. So the staff has time to assemble this, and then they take it down again later. Now, when you have a glass house in the country, occasionally you'll have a wild turkey that flies into the glass. At the time Johnson did this, and this is also true with the Farnsworth house, is plate glass, not tempered, not safety glass. Plate glass breaks in the manner that you see in this picture, in very jagged, large sections. And that's very unsafe. That's why tempered glass is called safety glass. And you can see the large pieces. This particular incident that happened in, this is around 2005, actually put a permanent gash in the glass table that's there in the background when the glass hit it. It didn't cut the leather on the daybed, fortunately. And the glass has been replaced with tempered glass. Now, for those of you who know glass, you know that tempered glass is different than plate glass. It looks different, it's made differently, and tempered glass has a little wave to it. And so this creates a big problem for those dealing with mid-century modern buildings. Fortunately, Johnson lived there long enough that he'd already broken pieces of glass. With turkeys flying into it, he actually broke one with his shoulder when he was very old and he fell. And he rolled into a piece of glass. He wasn't hurt, but the glass had to be replaced. He always replaced with safety glass. So we had the precedent, and we could just go with the safety glass when we did the replacement. And the program, I don't know if they finished replacing all the glass, but the idea was, as a critical priority, to replace every piece of glass with safety glass. Now, at the Farnsworth House, and this is a detail back to the Farnsworth House. When I first arrived on site, I was told one piece of glass has been replaced. It happened in the flood that also damaged the wardrobe I mentioned earlier. And every other piece is original. So I said, okay, that's nice. I'm glad. I don't know what we're going to do about that because we have this problem with plate glass being very unsafe. And as I inspected the house carefully and looked around, I found that more than half of the pieces had already been replaced. And you can tell because it says on it, tempered glass. So they weren't keeping, Palumbo hadn't kept records. And everyone thought it was original glass, but it wasn't. And everyone at the time was saying, it's going to change the way the building looks. And I was able to say, it already got changed. So we can keep doing it. It's still controversial. And the pieces have not all been replaced at Farnsworth House because people don't like the idea of changing out the glass because it has a slight wave to it. In order to get the tempered glass to be made very, very smooth, it costs a lot of extra money because they have to slow down the whole assembly line in order to put it over the rollers at a very low speed. But it can be done. So now let's talk a little bit about the designation types. This is my handwritten notes from a chalkboard lecture that I gave to my class where I was essentially quizzing them about what are all the ways that properties are designated in the US. So we have the international level, of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee can bestow upon a cultural site a World Heritage designation, cultural, natural, or both. As was mentioned, the San Antonio Missions are now designated a World Heritage Site. And then at the federal level, we can call things a National Historic Landmark, which is part of the National Register of Historic Places, or we can have a president designate a national monument, such as the Lincoln Cottage is a national monument designated by President Clinton. And these national registers, designated places, have legal weight. They are a mechanism of protection. They promote tax credits for rehabilitation of historic buildings. But as I said before, they don't really protect unless there's a federal undertaking or unless a private individual is voluntarily pursuing tax credits. And the tax credit program is every 6 years or so, the US Congress says we should get rid of it, and preservationists fight to save it. It's up for debate again now. It may not survive, or maybe it will. So far it has, since the 1980s. And then at the state level, we have state historic preservation officers. So the state historic preservation officers, all 50 states have them. They're in the state capital. The districts have them. The Native American tribes have tribal preservation officers that function like a state historic preservation officer. And in Texas, it's called the Texas Historical Commission. That's the name of our state historic preservation office. And they have ways of designating too. In Texas, we have the registered Texas Historic Landmark as the primary one. There's an older name that's state antiquities landmarks. So each state has its own version. So it starts to get very complicated when you get down below the federal government level. And that has to do with the U.S. Constitution that gives rights to the states. The Constitution says all rights that are not enumerated herein are granted to the states. And so that's where the principle of the autonomy of the states comes into play in the U.S. And of course it makes things very messy for us preservationists because then we have to look and see, is it designated at the federal level? What are its statewide designations? And then we have to look at the local level because the local level is where things really work. Things are truly protected best and most by local municipalities, local cities. And they establish what are essentially zoning laws, these ordinances that they pass through their city councils, and they set up these mechanisms, and almost without exception, they all reference the Secretary of the Interior standards as the mechanism for compliance with their ordinance. So when they have to come up with, okay, this has been designated, this is now protected, we're going to have a process of review, well, what are they going to review it with? Then they reference the federal standards in the local municipal code. So that's kind of how it works. So one of the things now for transformation of where we're going next in historic preservation, one of the things that we're doing at the Research Center, the Center for Cultural Sustainability, we're trying to explore the continuity of the cultural systems of human existence. Because that's part of sustainability too. It's not just about energy saving or building green. It's social and it's cultural and heritage is involved in that. So, our definition of historic preservation, a process of design for cultural continuity and the management of change respectful of a heritage context. You may have your own definition. If I'd asked you all at the beginning to write down your definition and hand it in to me, I'm sure you would not have written this. You would have written maybe something similar, and I bet everybody would have written something slightly different. But this is what we teach at my university. It's similar to what I was taught at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied. And I know from talking to others in academia, there's some commonality, but it's not uniform. But the idea that it's a process for managing change and that it's a design endeavor, this is essential. Because to those who think that it would be locking us into a straitjacket from the past, this is the answer. No, it's not locking anyone into anything. It's about managing change. So we have to, when we manage this change, and this is the Alamo, which is also Mission San Antonio de Valero, we have to think about how things look, how we want to interpret them, and what is their period of historical significance. So we often have three periods, and it's very well demonstrated at the Alamo. The Alamo is famous in Texas, not globally, but locally, for a battle that was, remember the Alamo, for Texas independence. You've probably all heard the term the Alamo. Yes? No? Some? Only David? And this is part of the cultural identity of Texas. And Texas is a state, in case you didn't know it, that thinks of itself as kind of its own nation. And it has an identity that likes to believe that it's separate and independent and apart. And occasionally we have a governor who says, well, we'll just secede and become our own nation again, like we were back in the 1800s. Because it was a nation for 8 years. Although Mexico didn't think it was a nation, Mexico thought it was just a rogue state that had broken off. And they wanted it back, and they kept reinvading it. Until there was a war that ended that in the 1840s. So the Alamo is part of that history. And that's the interpretation that they tell at the site. If you go visit San Antonio, You'll see our Riverwalk, it's beautiful, and you'll see the Alamo from Alamo Plaza, and people will talk about this battle. But it doesn't look like the battle, because the city grew up around it. It was a prosperous city, it was the biggest city in Texas in the 1920s, and it became what the Spanish colonists intended for it to become. A nice place to live, a real city, with people doing endeavors and being prosperous. And so those changes happened over time, and what was the scene of this famous battle is no longer the way it looks. So the period of historical significance, well, that covers about 10,000 years, because this particular site, the reason why the Spanish went there, and when you look at any site where the Spanish were colonizing, they went to places that were good places, where there was water, and there was food or game, or here we had pecans, and there were already citizens, future citizens of Spain living there that could be colonized. And so this period of historical significance extends way beyond the battle on both sides for hundreds and hundreds of years. And all these things have to exist together. So that's important for us to parse out and keep in mind. And we have to think about authenticity and why authenticity is important at historic places. And this is where we start getting into values. And this is the big transformation in U.S. historic preservation. It's the idea that we can look to values and understand what our heritage is about and why it's relevant and why it's important to people. And we value authenticity. It has education value, it has material value, and it has intangible values as well. So I like to say for this material value, I often refer to, I said, the Abraham Lincoln shiver, and that's because in Abraham Lincoln's house, this national monument, when people touch things that Lincoln could have touched, they get a shiver. And I don't get it, because I see too much history. But people will actually visibly shake from coming in contact with something that they know Abraham Lincoln also touched. And so there is a material value that we humans have that's important to us. And when we know it's the authentic thing, this is surviving from a time period in history, it's not a reproduction. It's real. That has value. That's authenticity. And with that, we can tell honest stories, because the real material can't lie. It can only be. And this intangible value has to do with how people use a place. And that's very important. So why do we preserve the tangible things? What are our motivations? Why do things have relevance? They all fall into these categories of they have educational value, they have political value because we use them, they have social value, and they have economic value, as was mentioned earlier. These are values of the San Antonio Mission's urban historic landscape that I've identified just off the top of my head, working with the students, 10 different things that are valuable out in the landscape. Part of the cultural identity of the place. It has a spiritual value because of the religious worship that occurs. It's familiar to people who go there once, they go again, the people that live there, it's aesthetic beauty, a recreation value. It's a differentiation value. When you're in San Antonio, you're not somewhere else. And you differentiate, and you have a comparative analysis. A continuity value of intangible heritage. The evidence, the patina, the layers of time, so abundant all around us here in Barcelona. It's thick with patina. It's beautiful. And the association of being near history. That increases value. People like to be in a historic zone. Maybe they don't like to stay there. They want to get out into the, for the weekend they want to leave, but then they like to work there. And this intangible heritage at the missions includes this authenticity of people. Traditions, food, music, dance, religion, worship. And we see it at the Pueblo of Taos as well, another World Heritage Site. And so the term dynamic heritage comes into play. The idea that you can have heritage that's changing over time, and you can allow it to be changed, you can be comfortable with it changing, so long as there's a continuity. You don't have to lock it in place. You can respect the values of the past that are relevant today and allow the heritage to slowly morph And that's why I'm comfortable if I go to the Pueblo of Acoma, where they have the oral tradition, if the story changes a little bit, personally I'm okay with that. Because it's their story, it's their heritage. So when I teach the students, I talk to them about site analysis and how site analysis includes people. Many times when we do our school projects, our design studio projects, there isn't time to fully engage the public, but you have to recognize that the project team all needs to have input. They all need to be equals, that there are stakeholders, people who see political value in what you're doing. There's natives and residents, people that work there, visitors, users, future people that you've got to accommodate for. There has to be a process of inclusion, discussion, and decisions. And most important, everybody who comes together has to be aware that we all have cultural bias. We're all ignorant of something about somebody else. I don't know any of you in the room, and you don't know me. And we have to accept that and work together. And so we have to recognize that we're coming from different contexts. We have cultural bias, things that I'm ignorant about. And I'll stumble and trip when I talk to you. And I may say things that upset you because I didn't know I was saying something that you didn't like. But we can still have a conversation. We have to, because we have to explore these values. We have to listen to each other. And we have to take the time to listen. And that's something that as professionals we're not trained to do. When I bring my team to Cuba, they were handpicked to be people that listen, or that are willing to listen, as opposed to come in and give the solution. Because as professionals, if we're really, really good at what we do, we find the answer really fast, and that impresses our client. But what it omits is the opportunity to hear from people who are associated with the heritage and whose opinion is very, very important to achieving what we need to do. And we have to take the time to listen really carefully and recognize that even a person who might appear to be a crazy person who talks and talks and talks and everybody wishes that person would stop, they will have kernels, small elements that are really important to hear and to get from them. So this design methodology that we teach in my university to develop these objectives, policies, strategies, we think about the history, the values, the legal context, the integrity of the place, the uses, past, present, future, the chronology of change over time. These are the elements that go into making a good design choice. And this value-led approach to planning, to understand the tangible and the intangible values of heritage. And then the site analysis in thinking about cultural sustainability recognizes that we as architects are keepers of a wisdom of past cultures, that we can send that continuity forward from past to future. Like a little ship that we send sail across a body of water from past to forward. And just at the very end here, there's an element that talks about this 400-year window. And this is something I try to spend a lot of time on with my students, to get them to at least think 2 centuries back and 2 centuries forward. And have that be your present moment. Many times we think of our present moment as today, or now is here and now, but why does now have to be only today, or this quarter, or this quarterly report if we're business people, or if we're a politician? Why is it a 5-year plan? Where's the 200-year plan? Why can't we think backwards and forwards as a present moment occupying a bigger amount of time? You can. And when you think that way, you start to make smarter decisions. And so when we do design studio projects and we're thinking about management of heritage, we're trying to get the students to think about this 400-year window for cultural continuity. Thanks.
Thank you, William. Does anybody have any questions right now? If not, we're going to have a small break. Anybody?
What do you need to do?
No, we have 5 minutes for...
We have 5 minutes of time. Yeah.
Sophia?
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I was going to ask you about 2 projects that have been quite controversial in New York City.
Okay.
One is the Museum of Modern Art, the additions of the Museum of Modern Art, and also the second one is the preservation and/or renovation of the Four Seasons dining room that was designed by Philip Johnson, embedded into Mies van der Rohe's building.
Right. Which
And-
included removal of a piece of art that was intended to hang in the building.
Exactly.
Yeah, and all the silverware was even designed for that
Exactly.
space that's gone.
So, in your opinion, is that an example of dynamic heritage, or is that falls into a different category?
Well, it's certainly dynamic, but I think it disrespects the heritage, that particular instance. I don't know very well the issues with the Museum of Modern Art, but with regard to the Four Seasons, I think it's a shame to see the art that was intended to be displayed and used in the space to be removed. It seems like it was unnecessary. It was a personal choice because of the dislike of the owner for that particular, and an interest in just making it new and different. And so there was a disrespect of heritage because the owner just didn't care to consider it. And I think that's very short-sighted. But now, how do you persuade the owner, maybe, in terms of
Yes. Now, so this
dealing
falls
with
into
that?
the owner's responsibility, doesn't it?
It's a problem with protection of heritage, perhaps globally, but certainly in the U.S., because we're a nation of laws that are in favor of private owners and the rights of individuals. And so that has pros and cons. And many times the rights of individuals produce wonderful benefits for our society. But when we deal with issues of heritage and the individual doesn't like the heritage, they can change it. Even if people say don't and they try to put pressure on them, there isn't a particular law that can block what happened at the Four Seasons. And so, as I said earlier, the only way that you can truly protect something is to own it. And so if it's that important, then that means that somebody or some government unit has to step up and buy it or lease it. And then perhaps, for example, the Farnsworth House, the National Trust bought it at auction for over $7 million in order to save it, because the second highest bidder was intending to move it from the place where it was built. And the National Trust felt that in order to save that masterpiece, it had to be where it belongs, in Plano on the Fox River. And so they spent $7 million that they raised privately in order to keep it from being moved. That's the primary reason why it became a National Trust site. They had no intention of expanding into that realm. It was only to fight that preservation battle and win. The San Antonio Conservation Society and many others around the nation save buildings by purchasing them. Now, purchasing the Four Seasons and that whole, that's a massive sum of money just to save some art. Nobody stepped forward to do it. So that's where we see the measure of heritage sometimes. How much are you willing to fight for it? What are you willing to give up? What will you spend? How important is it to you? And that's what it comes down to in the U.S. So it's a great example of showing how these individual rights can sometimes hold sway. Do you want to add something, David?
No, the only thing I was going to ask for a clarification on your question about owner. Do you mean about the controversy about the destruction of the Folk Art Museum?
Yes.
Okay. You know the.
Can you address it?
Okay, I'll address it. The issue is that in order for the Museum of Modern Art to do an expansion, they have taken down a building, a recent building by Todd Williams and Billy Chen, who are now the architects for Barack Obama's presidential library, which was a small, quirky, but very, very compelling little building. And the idea is that it was taken down. This is a very interesting controversy about very recent heritage, because this is a building that was just built in the 1990s. It's not very old at all. And it's something that we are dealing more and more with when you're talking about the heritage of the recent past. And typically in the United States, we have a 50-year rule that in most jurisdictions, properties attain a certain, they are eligible for certain layers of protection at 50 years unless they are deemed to be exceptionally significant. There's a certain statute within the Secretary of the Interior standards that allows that. This building was never designated, but it was a very interesting and very quirky. It's really a work of art, and rather not a friendly building. It had this cast bronze facade that really it was almost like a piece of sculpture sitting on the street. And it was a building that certainly did not take maximum advantage of what you could build on that site from a zoning envelope standpoint. And the Museum of Modern Art is a very hungry or thirsty, however you choose to put it, organization. Always seems to need more space. Always seems to want to do more within that site. I personally think that they should not have done what they did. They should have found another way around it. And I think that, because I do think that facade was a facade that was worth keeping, I think perhaps they could have. Now, then you get into, of course, the problems of, and maybe you have some comment on this, about we are saving part of a building. It's something that we call, in a negative fashion in the United States, a facadectomy, and you see this a lot, where only the front of the building is preserved and then something enormous is put up behind it. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but I think this was there were kind of two primary values with this building. One was the space itself, the interest of the museum and what was in it, but the other was this very unique facade, this street presence of the building, rather than the building as a totality. So I think I think it shows a very interesting side of the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, I think it exposed a sort of dark underbelly of their culture about what they really value and what they are looking at and what their motivations are for doing this.
Okay, thank you for that question, Sophia, because it brought up some good points. And especially also showed us, I think, a very different approach to heritage protection between the United States and Europe, where we actually can protect private property. And that also links back, I think, to the general subject and how protecting heritage links us to the future, because protecting our past tells us where we come from and where we should go, maybe, too. So we'll have a short coffee break now, and then we'll go on with it. Maybe. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. So we'll continue with our program and now have a closer look at a typical couple of case studies. It's Mr. David Fixler, honorary AIA fellow as well, who will give us a couple of examples of his work. So David Fixler is an independent professional now, a former principal at EIP, Architecture and Engineering. He is an internationally recognized leader in the field of historic preservation, with a particular focus on the preservation of buildings of the mid-20th century, of the modern movement. His projects have involved buildings designed by many of the leaders of the modern movement, including Alvar Aalto. He actually is here just coming back from Finland, where he was participating in a counseling workshop to brainstorm on how to find a new mission for the Salo town hall designed by Aalto. He also worked on buildings by Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier and Eero Saarinen. He's a frequent writer and lecturer on architecture and preservation. David has had his design and written work published both in the United States and internationally in magazines and like Architecture Record, Journal of Society of Architectural Historians, Boston Architecture, the APT Bulletin. The APT is the Architectural Preservation Technology Association. Maybe you can have a word about that. David has lectured at numerous North American colleges and universities, including Harvard, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania in Virginia, MIT, and RISD in Rhode Island School of Design, and conceived and helped to organize and participated in numerous domestic and international conferences on a wide range of architecture and preservation topics. He has written a book on Aalto and America, co-authored with Stanford Anderson and Gail Fenske, which was published in 2012 by the Yale University Press. Finally, David Fixler is the co-founder and president of the Docomomo New England chapter in the United States, and the past United States representative of the ICS, International Specialty Committee for Registers of the Docomomo chapter. He's the co-chair of the Association for Preservation Technology, Committee on Modern Heritage, and a peer review architect for the GSA Design Excellence Program, and a member of the Heritage Conservation Committee of the Society of Architectural Historians. The right person for us to talk about this subject. So David, please give us your story.
Hello. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Es un honor estar aquí. And that's as far as I can get in Spanish, but I wanted to let you know that. Okay. I'm going to take you through a couple of case studies on buildings by Louis Kahn and Eero Saarinen. But before that, I want to do a little bit of a warm-up about modern heritage and just touch on some of the bigger issues that we get to, some of the major points that one needs to deal with in dealing with these buildings. Oh, there we go. Okay. So modernism becomes history and is resurrected. Now, obviously, for all of us who have been, most of us have been raised and trained in some way, form, or another as modern architects, and one understands that one of the most important characteristics, one of the character-defining features, if you like, of modernism is its dynamism. And the idea, the sort of paradox in the idea of modern heritage and how one deals with that. And that's something I've been dealing with as long as I've been dealing with modern buildings, which is over 25 years now. And I show these two particular images because they involve two images that are there at the birth of the preservation movement for modernism. On the left, you see Bernard Tschumi's from a sort of manifesto he wrote in the 70s about what really makes architecture. And here's architecture really, this building has become architecture because it's become a ruin and lost its original meaning, and it will only survive. It will only survive as and its value as architecture, a little bit like what Aldo Rossi was talking about with autonomous architecture. But importantly, in 1959, Le Corbusier contacted André Malraux, the French Minister of Culture, and said, my building is falling apart. The Villa Savoye is falling apart. What are you going to do about this? So that hence began the drive to restore modern buildings. And then on the right, Le Corbusier's own Unité d'Habitation, which was the first modern building ever listed, again by the French when the building was only 12 years old. So there is a recognition already back in the 1960s that this was going to be heritage and we were going to have to deal with it. I need to be closer, I guess. There we go. Okay, so Docomomo was founded in 1988 in Holland, and you have a Docomomo chapter right here in this building, Docomomo Iberico, which is one of really the foundation, the pillars of Docomomo. And Susanna just walked in right on cue as I said that. And but they were really founded around this building and the fact that it was in the state that you see on the left, the ruins of the Zonnestrahl Sanatorium. And but again, sort of the irony of this is the architect who designed this building, Dijker, really said, I don't need to do a building with great permanence. In 20 or 30 years, there will be no tuberculosis. You won't need this building anymore. Let me build something as light and simple and clean as possible, and hence this building was born. And now, of course, it had to be completely sort of taken apart and reconstructed in order to rebuild it. And this brings up very real ideas about what exactly it is we are preserving here in terms of both the idea and the materiality, because most of what you see in that picture on the right is new material. There's very little that was actually restored outside of the frame of the building itself. The windows are new, the finishes are new, all of that. So it's legitimate, it's real, and it's wonderful to have it as something that one can admire what functionalist architecture was like in the 1920s, but it's also a little bit paradoxical. Whoops, I'm sorry, I need to be, oh, okay, back. I'm going to stand on this side. Maybe it'll be better. Yeah, okay. As Karsten mentioned, I did just come from a workshop in Finland. We are starting to lay the groundwork to perform a conservation management plan for the Seinäjoki Town Hall. And conservation planning is something that I'm doing a lot of these days, and I think it's a very valuable exercise because what it does is it really gets at the essence of what you are trying to conserve and how you are going to place this within, as Bill very well put it, this great continuum of history, looking back and looking forward, and how this building will then continue to be managed well into the future. And it's the way I like to treat all of my projects, and I think it's very exciting that that the Finns are taking this initiative for this building, which now has lost its purpose because there is no longer a municipality of Seinäjoki, and therefore they don't need a town hall, and so it has to be repurposed as something else. For 10 years, I worked on the renovation of the United Nations, and I can't speak a lot about that, but I will just give you a few words about some of the work that we did on this. And I think this was a particularly interesting project because it really brings in everything. It brings in this has all, the entire panoply of values that one associates with a site, except perhaps sort of native indigenous values, but certainly the political, cultural, social, economic, all of the cultural values come to play when you're looking at a building like this. But again, what you are really after here is making a truly, but at core, what you're doing is you're renewing the institution so that it can do its job. And we had to do this in a heritage-sensitive fashion, but also with things like the curtain walls, which had to be replaced because they were experimental in their time and they had failed, but they also, the requirements changed. They need to be resistant now for safety, security, blast, this kind of thing. They need to be much, much more robust. And finding ways to do this in a way that is still sympathetic with the original architecture, to keep all of those delicate lines the same, is a big issue. And I'm going to be talking in the two buildings that I talk about. I'm going to spend a lot of time on windows because it's one of the really key issues, as Bill did in his talk, talking about the two houses, for how these buildings are sort of perceived and used going into the future, measuring sustainability against the aesthetics. Character definition, again, to echo a theme that Bill brought up, every little thing matters in a building like this. The spaces are open, they're simple, they're minimal, and so even if you're changing something like a switch for a light fixture or a radiator, all of these things matter and have to be taken into account very seriously in order to be successful in bringing these through. The importance of the kind of industrial products that were developed for these. These become important character-defining elements in a building like this. And again, finding ways in which to redo the guts of them, to make the technology work by today's standards, but to sort of keep them the way it is. There's an interesting sort of dichotomy here. Some of it can become evident, some of it you want to have hidden. And again, it's whether, from a preservation philosophy standpoint, it brings up many very interesting issues about what is real when you're talking about expressions of technology in a modern building. And last, I wanted to finish on the UN with this transformation of the Trusteeship Council Chamber, because this to me brings many of these threads together. The Trusteeship Council was formed originally for the process of decolonization. At the end of the Second World War, of course, there were many countries that were owned, so to speak, primarily by European countries, and the whole but everyone knew at this point that these countries had to achieve their independence, and trusteeship was designed to foment that. That process is virtually done at this point. It's complete, and so it has taken on new meaning, but it has also over time changed from something that would accommodate 71 nations to accommodate 192, and had lost at this point much of its original character. So what we set out to do with the Danes, working with the Danes, who were the donor country for this room, was to come up with a way in which to sort of recreate the original spirit of this plan, to go back to many of the original finishes, but at the same time to come up with a new idea for the table, for the technology, for all of the things that make this room work, and to do it in a way that the Danes actually ran a competition in their country to come up with a new table and a new system for this as a kind of an evolution. So this to me is a very interesting way of expressing the management of change. It's to say, we are going to let this room evolve, we're going to change the furniture, but we're going to keep the really important things about it, the things that don't interfere with the way it works and really abet the way it works, and let them run and let them exist side by side with these wonderful new tables, and give both a new meaning and a new look to this building. So now we come to the Richards Laboratory by Louis Kahn. This is a building built in Pennsylvania for the University of Pennsylvania. It's a laboratory structure. And it's a building that's had a very interesting and checkered history. So as we started this commission, we were very careful to develop a philosophy of adaptation. And it starts with I'm going to start with a few quotes by sort of favorite people that I listen to about preservation. This from Ada Louise Huxtable: what preservation is really all about is the retention and active relationship with the buildings of the past to the community's functioning present. And then from Paul Byard, who ran the program at Columbia for many years: every act of preservation is inescapably an act of renewal by the light of a lighter time, etc. And then finally, the last two lines are really from Inga Saffron, who wrote a review of the work that we did when it was finished that we're very pleased about, because really it means an accommodation of present need with past original vision, but a radical transformation at the same time to enable it to become, in her words, the building that Kahn always wanted it to be. So this is what we were after, giving something that could work for the University of Pennsylvania while at the same time realizing something that Kahn was never able to really realize with the original laboratories in his lifetime. So here's the site on the West Campus in Philadelphia. and then the plan and a couple of quotes about the building. No space you can do. This quote from Louis Kahn is really about the idea that he thought scientists work like architects and wanted to build open studio spaces. And those blank spaces that you see in these 3 buildings, they were meant to be open labs. And by the way, the Richards Laboratory is this grouping. These 2 buildings here are the Goddard Labs, also by Kahn. They were added later. They were not buildings that we worked on in doing the renovation. They don't quite have the purity of design of the earlier buildings. They are nonetheless very much a part of the complex and part of the fact that it is listed. And I should mention that this is a National Historic Landmark, so it does have a degree of protection that is rare for an institutional buildings. It's very rare for a college or a university to allow one of their own structures to be listed, no matter how well they value it. That just is not, so to speak, the American way. But you see there's a series of these are the served spaces that revolve around this servant tower C, and it's really this is something that Kahn is very famous for, and this is probably the most literal interpretation of the servant versus served, because he actually makes separate buildings out of each of these, and you can read them very clearly. But finally, the Vincent Scully quote: "They are a town of colleagues, but function not perfectly at all." The building had a lot of problems, which we will get into as I go along here. So here you see the ideal on the right, really, which is the structure. He worked with an engineer named August Commandant, who was an early visionary concrete structural engineer. They developed this Vierendeel truss system hung off of 8 columns in each of the towers with a lot of cantilevers. And there you kind of see the purity of the grids the primary grid and the secondary grids. And that's the reality, the kind of open reality that Kahn looked for in this building. Whereas the real, that's the ideal rather. This is the architecture, you can see, divides it up into lots of little spaces, which is not Kahn's idea, but it became, in fact, the way that the scientists wanted to work in the laboratory, and they never really got everything to fit. Even though there was a system designed to accommodate these walls, it is not something that we had the sense that Kahn ever really wanted to be present. So here you see the building being built. It's very, very apparent about the sort of the way in which the structure reads. This is probably, there is a more overt reading of the structure in this building than in any other building that Kahn designed. This is sort of the apex of that idea in his career. He was working not only with August Commandant, but also with Ann Ting in his office, with whom he did also the art gallery, and began these explorations in structural concrete systems to be able to find ways to weave the systems in with, along with it. And so I love this image because this is before they filled in any of the interiors, and it really just looks like a stack of vitrines, you know, a pristine stack of these wonderfully taut, minimal vitrines. And this is really, this is the ideal. This is the notion that we always had to come back to as we were doing our work to make sure that this kind of reading continued to be felt. And this idea, too, that the way he groups these communities of scholars and scientists, that you can kind of look into your neighbor's laboratory and get a sense of this communication. It very rarely happened, in fact, but it was very much a part, too, of what Kahn wanted to happen with this building. So looking at Kahn's development, it's very interesting with Louis Kahn to look at his developmental sketches, because he is, you think of his work as being highly disciplined and highly rational, and you realize he comes with this very, very broad zigzagging path and tries out a little bit of everything before he finally gets to the resolution. And I think this is a perfect example. The other thing he was obsessed with in this building was the fact that this is his first laboratory and that you have to move vast quantities of air in and out. So he's imagining here with these stacks, saying you need a certain amount, and as you go up the building, you're getting more and more air that you're having to exhaust out the top. And so this is a very kind of literal expression of that. And the other was, he would originally envision the Vierendeels to be a 9 square within a 9 square within a 9 square grid rather than a 4 square within a 9 square grid. And you have this kind of stepping here, which is a much more radical, I think, and fussy way of dealing with the expression of the structure. This was changed for cost reasons in the end, although Kahn was quite happy, and I think we're all quite happy with the solution that was ended up. And obviously these were merely an early exploration. But you can also see here he actually has round tops on the ouches here, similar to what Sert did at the Miro Foundation, but obviously not something that survived in this building at all. Here again, a very early sketch. This is the plan view of that sketch with these vent stacks walking up the building. The idea that this is happening in the very early stages of design. So right from the beginning, there's an integration here of the systems into the building, and the way in which the engineering system become also a character-defining feature is very, very important to the reading of this building as the design evolves and as our renovation scheme also had to evolve. So here you see some of these design principles. And this is a nice photograph of the space showing the open floor. This is the way Kahn wanted it before they put in the partitions, before they cluttered it up with a lot of things. And you can see the organization of the building systems overhead. And what this, what this drawing here does is it shows you exactly how they are stratified. I don't expect you can read all that, but it tells you where the ductwork goes, it tells you where the wiring goes, it tells you where the plumbing goes, and how all of that is supposed to work. And he even has these sort of details for how to come up and down through the building in order to keep everything in its proper stratum. And the fact that these principles were not always held to as the building evolved over the years and changes inevitably had to be made as happened in any laboratory building. That's one of the things that really compromised the character and that we had to set about changing as we began to develop our renovation. So here, some of the most exquisite ductwork for people, anybody who's a kind of a geek about ductwork. He got the most incredibly beautiful, seamless ductwork put into this building, and that's something that we actually had a little bit of difficulty with in doing the renovation to sort of achieve that same level of quality in the work that we put back that was done originally, and we also found out in the course of doing this that Kahn was not happy with the original installation and went in and had the contractor tear everything out and do it over again, much to the university's consternation, but to for the benefit of us as architects and historians admiring the quality of this work. Here's a sort of a diagram of the supply and return, showing again how all of that ductwork interleaves with the structure. This is from a book by Thomas Leslie called Louis Kahn, Building Art, Building Science, and it shows you in kind of wonderful detail how all of these various pieces go together. So this is all stuff that we had to sort of understand and put into the design and preservation guidelines to be able to sort of accommodate this in a new way as our design evolved. And here's the principle about respecting the structural grid. And I show you this because this is the first rule we had to break. This is the way in which Kahn said, all right, if you have to put walls in, at least align them with the trusses. But he also showed us in little out-of-the-way places, he gave us clues as to how to break the rules, and I'll get to that in a minute. But this is you can see the plan on the right and then the diagram about how that works with the structure overhead on the left. He was obsessive about keeping things aligned to the point where he wanted his doors and other openings to all be at the same line. So he actually, in this case, eliminates the head detail. And this is the frame of the door right here at the head is just a simple stop so that the door can come all the way up and you don't read the frame coming across. This gets a little obsessive, but on the other hand, again, it reinforces, though, the idea to us about how simple, straightforward, and precise our interventions needed to be in order to work. It wasn't necessarily that we were copying anything that he did literally or directly as we changed things, but that there was a spirit there that we had to honor in order for this to be successful, and that precisely the things that had made it fail in the past had been because people didn't recognize that and made these little adjustments which really weren't appropriate to making the building work. So here you see the ideal and the real again. This building was very famous before it was even built. Vincent Scully called it one of the great works of the 20th century. It had its own show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961, just before it opened. And then shortly thereafter, people began to inhabit it, and very soon, within a few years, it didn't take until 2011, but within a few years, things like what you see on the right began to occur, light fixtures being placed in off-center locations, and then particularly things like running these conduits down through the wall where they're really not supposed to go. So in order to accommodate and working with a maintenance staff that didn't always understand the building the way it meant to be understood, these things kept happening over the years and began to diminish the quality of the building. So here are basically the list of challenges that we went through in working with the building, and I'm going to concentrate right now on the envelope, because I think a big theme of what I'm talking about today is how one handles the glazing in a building like this, because it is such a critical character defining element, and getting that all just right is a very important thing. And then here, those were the sort of the problems we're dealing with, and then these are the adaptive solutions. So I'm going to kind of go through these all one by one, and in the interest of staying on time and not overstaying my welcome, rather than reading these all to you, I think I will just go through and start with the glazing upgrades. If anyone wants to come back to this, or if you would like me to read through these, I can do that. It's your choice. So, Kahn developed a relationship with steel windows very early in his career, as many modern architects did. His first building using them was the Yale University Art Gallery, which you see here on the left in New Haven, Connecticut. And this was a relatively conventional steel window system. These were Hopes or Crittall windows. I believe they were Crittall, in fact, but they were all pretty much the same kind of system. However, Kahn was not happy with these windows because he felt that they were imprecise, that they used too much material, and that the fact that the shapes are rolled means that you don't have precise corners and edges, and that there is basically just far too much going on for what he wanted to do in his architecture. So in his next building that he did shortly thereafter, it's a building that unfortunately does not exist anymore. This is the American Federation of Labor Medical Services building in Philadelphia. He starts to develop, you can see now all of a sudden you see far, far less in the way of windows. You have these strong dividing lines at the floors, and then very, very minimal mullions separating the glazed and the fixed panels within the building. And the way he did this was he did several explorations. He looked first at a steel system, like Yale. He rejected that. He then went to an aluminum system, which was also starting to be fairly common at the time, and he didn't like that either because you had to use too much weight in terms of the aluminum being not as strong as steel. So what he finally starts to develop is this bent stainless steel plate. This is heavy gauge stainless steel plate that he forms on a brake metal, like woofers do. It forms into the shapes you want. And glazing the windows, putting the glass directly into these frames with there it is, with a little stop, there's the glass, and then these frames like this. Now, this makes for an incredibly elegant glazing system. And it is the system that he then carries forward into Richards. This is one of the working drawings for the Richards labs. But it brings up a real question, of course. If you're going to be working with this, and it is conceivably certainly one of the most, if not the most elegant glazing system I've ever come across. But it doesn't have a thermal break. So it is something that one needs to understand. If you're working with this as a heritage building, you can have the kind of leeway to provide or not provide the thermal break. But as a matter of due diligence, we did look at seeing whether or not a thermally broken version of this could be done and with insulating glass. But let me first show you that he continued to develop this throughout his career. The next major building he does is the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. And at the Salk, whereas you think of Salk of having these beautiful wood windows in the studies, in fact, the laboratories are all glazed with a system like this, which is basically a continued evolution of this same idea. So he uses this right up until his very last building, the Yale Art Gallery, the second Yale Art Gallery, the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, and really brings so much of what one thinks of as the character definition of these huge expanses of glass with almost nothing holding them in place, much less than would be evidenced with a typical steel frame, comes from this exploration. And this was something that we felt was very important to acknowledge and celebrate as we were developing our renovation. So here is that evolution. So, and these are corner conditions at each one. So first at the Yale Art Gallery, there you see in conventional steel, probably looks very familiar to most people. Next to that is what he did at the AFFL building. At Richards, he develops this incredibly elegant cruciform corner post to hold the system together. But in all of these, there's the idea of the reentrant corner, that he's really making this corner as a reentrant corner, and then finally simplified at Salk. But at Salk, you're dealing with a structure that holds the glass at the top and the bottom, whereas you're not at Richards. At Richards, that post floats free and creates some issues. So here is Kahn's elevation and the actual profiles of that glazing system. It's a very taut, minimal system, very little projection, and what's interesting to me is that I heard a lot as I was learning about the history of modern architecture about the development of minimal glazing systems, and no one ever talked about this one. What you did hear about was this building, which is the Marine Midland Bank by Gordon Bunshaft of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, 10 years later than Kahn's building, and he proudly proclaims that nothing on this building projects more than half an inch, or what would that be? A few millimeters beyond the face of the building, when in fact Kahn had achieved that at Richards' lab without talking about it, but he achieved it that many years earlier. So here again, there's again this image of the sort of stacked vitrines, and on the right is a photograph that I took shortly before we began the work, and it's a little hard to see, but this is one of the things that you're dealing with in a building like this. That line is no longer straight. What has happened over time is that the concrete has crept and sort of sagged a little bit, and the brick has expanded and moved out a little bit, and consequently the corner mullion, which is this piece right here, you see it floats free. It just has a butt glazed corner above it, so it's a cantilever off of the wall there. So all of that is being deformed, which means that the glass, in many cases, you could actually see daylight coming through where some of these some of the seals had been. So you had a really very serious problem here, but also something to consider as we're going to go back and conceive the renovation and look at the replacement of this, that each one of these enormous lights of glass had to really be custom measured, because none of them were perfectly square. They're all a rhomboid or parallelogram or a trapezoid in form, and they also are kind of bending this way as well as being out of plumb. So it makes for some unique technical challenges as you're starting to come up with ways to kind of figure out how to fix that glazing. So here's the analysis of. We had to be very scientific about this, of course. There you see the idea of the sort of the cantilevered corner and the idea that it floats. What we determined was, with proper anchoring, we could make this all work. We didn't have that there was no danger. It just was bound to move, and we had to develop a system that would move along with the building. The other thing we discovered, too, is that in looking at historical data, it appears as though the concrete creep had pretty much stopped. The building is now almost 60 years old. And the the brick expansion also. So we could rely in looking at developing a solution, we could rely on the idea that probably there was going to be very little movement in the future, and we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that things hold together pretty well. But there is some elasticity built into our system which can accommodate that. One of the problems with this building has always been the abundance of natural light and the fact that the labs get very hot and there's a lot of glare, and when you're dealing with certain kinds of sensitive scientific work, it becomes extremely problematic. This is one of the great ironies of the building, is that Kahn actually designed this system of cool shades. These are aluminum screens that were meant to be put on the south and west facades of the building, and they were, and they're operable. The screens are operable. The windows are not operable, so you can't get at the screen. So once they get fixed in position, you would then have to get up on a lift or scaffolding in order to move the screens. Why no one thought of this, I don't know, but that is the way it was, although in fact, these had a relatively limited lifespan. They were taken off in the 1970s, and we never entertained putting them back. It was not something that the renovation ever seriously considered reinstalling as part of the original architecture. But there you see this very poetic view of somebody actually put draperies up here. And then much more common, though, in recent history has been people just putting up pieces of mylar or cardboard or plywood or something in front of the window in order for it to be, in order to cut the glare and to be able to manage it. They painted out the transems. They did all kinds of violence to this building in the interest of minimizing the sun. So here's a summary of the existing conditions. The frames themselves, the thing that I am so obsessed about, actually they remained in very good condition, albeit a little bit deformed. The anchors had to be redone. There were all of the things that I talked to you about already, but these were all solvable problems. So the issue then became really, there's the sort of the cruciform corner, but you see that there's a wonderful, as beautiful as these frames are as technical objects, there's also this kind of wonderful handmade quality about it. The idea that you're folding this like you're folding a piece of paper, like origami sort of, in order to create this, which gives it a kind of a unique quality that is not so technical, but really leans more back towards craft. So, a couple things. First of all, as I mentioned, we tried to do some due diligence about coming up with a way in which this system could possibly be thermally broken and incorporate an IGU. And these are just my own scribblings on the train one day. This is for somebody who wants to try this in the future. The way that this building was put together, we would have done great violence in pulling the frames out, and it was very early determined as we did this exploration that it wasn't worth sacrificing because you'd have to take apart the brickwork, you'd have to pull the reglets out of the concrete. There would be a lot of violence done to the building in removing those frames, and the frames were beautiful and eminently restorable. Their only problem was that they did not have a thermal break. So we looked at here, then you see on the existing corner, that's the existing glass, and these were enormous sheets of glass, and they were only 1/4 of an inch thick, so that's about little over a centimeter, a little less than a centimeter thick. And they were 15 feet by 5.5 feet, so they're quite large. We looked then at, so here would be an idea about using, this is what you'd have to go through in order to get a thermal break put into this. You can see how elaborate that all gets, and we're not even sure that stop would work. But here in the middle, circled, is basically just taking the glass that was there, doubling it in thickness, put it with an interlayer, and using laminated glass. And here's where, I've become a great advocate of this for precisely the reason Bill mentioned in the Farnsworth House and Glass House. My client would not accept tempered glass for those big windows for precisely the reasons of roller wave. The appearance of flatness and the reflections on this building are such a critical character defining feature that we tested it. We tried putting in a tempered light, and it just it was not to be. And frankly, the laminated glass was also gave us the possibility through the coating process and interlayer of introducing high-performance coatings on this. What we did is we used a coating that was as high performance as possible while still being invisible in order to improve its energy efficiency. And I've become a real kind of an apostle for laminated glass as opposed to the IGU solution because, as you all know, insulated glass units, they also have a problem of flatness when they get to be that big. It's very, very difficult for them to read dead flat because of the pressure differential between what's in the cavity and what's outside. But also, over time, the seals will be destroyed, and at least with the technology as it exists today, you then have to throw those enormous lights of glass away. You can't repurpose them. Whereas the laminated glass, we feel, has I won't say an indefinite lifespan, but certainly a greater lifespan than would an insulating glass unit. So then here you see a sectional view of the typical big window, and these pieces that project out, these are they are the tracks to hold what were the cool shades. So we left the tracks intact. We did not mess with that. We just didn't put the shading devices back. So then here is this was then our solution. They're also on on these lights up here. You notice some of them are blue glass. The blue was only on the south and west, again, meant to be it's really kind of a token sun screening gesture. It doesn't really do a whole lot. So we had to come up with a whole system of interior mechanized shades that fit very carefully on this mullion in order to really make this work going forward. So here's the review of the glass types. These were this was the final review. We started out with about a dozen different kinds. It was absolutely essential that they be flat, and it was essential that they be colorless. So we had to match the color of the original glass, which eliminates a lot of kinds of coatings that are used on windows these days, because we really couldn't have any hint of color. This was, because this is a National Historic Landmark, there actually was regulatory oversight to this, because it's part of the exterior of the building, and therefore was something that was in the jurisdiction, when working with the National Park Service to ensure that we met their criteria in realizing this. So then we had the great fortune of having this gentleman, who was the glazing installer, as our contractor, because we presented to him when we were walking him around the project all of the problems with the deformation and the fact that we're using now a heavier glass light, and all of the things that make this a virtually impossible job for a glazing contractor. And you could just see him brighten with every moment. He saw this as the challenge of his life. And I think it's very important, just as a kind of a parenthetic lesson, that it is very important when you're working on a building like this and when you're dealing with these very delicate subjects to take the time to really explain to the builders why this is an important building and why they should be, why it is in their interest to do really good work on the building. And obviously you do, not in a threatening fashion, but in a way that really sort of says, we want you to be part of the team. We realize that we cannot do this without you. And that we are relying on your expertise to help inform what we're doing to make this the best possible product. It's the only way to really work on these kinds of buildings and get them done well. There you see also the blue glass. We were very lucky with this. They don't make the particular kind of blue glass that Kahn had originally specified for the project, and we had to replace that as well. But they do, we were able to find a virtually exact match, and of course we also have a little bit more room to be more robust with the coatings when you're dealing with a blue glass, because they are less sensitive to picking up the subtle tints that are inherent in the coatings for the glass. It's interesting, the one sort of false bit of technical history that we did here is we did replicate the same black stop detail that was present in Kahn's original building. They were aluminum stops. However, given the very tight tolerances in the frame and the sort of deformation that we had to accommodate the fact that the glass was moving in and out depending on where it was, in the end we had to glaze it in structurally with silicone, and so the stops became superfluous. So we put them in as a finishing touch, and so that you could, it looks cleaner, and obviously it looks as it did originally. But in fact, structurally, they have no meaning. They don't need to be there. The frames or the glass is anchored entirely by the silicone structure on the outside. And there's the finished product. Hopefully that's flat enough. So now I'm going to move to the inside of the building, having taken care of the envelope. And by the way, I'm not talking about concrete and masonry repair on the outside in this because it wasn't part of our scope. It's not to say it didn't need to be done, and it could be the topic of a whole lecture unto itself, given problems with the building, but I'm not going to go into it here, except to acknowledge the fact that at some point it's all going to have to be part of the work. So these are the goals: efficiency, standardization, but adaptive standardization, culture of collaboration. Moving from wet bench, this is an important fact. We moved from it being a biochemistry lab, which means it needs fume hoods and all of that exhausting, to a dry neuroscience laboratory, which is primarily just computers. So a lot of the burden on the original HVAC system, and also the need to have these sort of cellular laboratory structures, went away with this change in program. And then finally, enhance, make the building better, make it something it had never been, because we had a lot of very unhappy users in this building to begin with. There were people, the medical school at the University of Pennsylvania was ready to abandon this building when we took on the project, because they were just tired of struggling against this. And so obviously it was incumbent upon us to come up with layouts and a plan to make this work. So first of all, we are, of course, working within a strict guideline in terms of the level of significance and what you can do where. So we sort of did these simple diagrams of what you can do in which areas, the yellow being actually the most sacred, but fortunately the area that needed to change the least. These three pavilions, they're actually, this is kind of a paradoxical thing about the preservation attitude on this building. They are, in fact, the most important parts of the building from what you see from the outside and what you experience from the inside. But they're really just an open space. The character definition, once you get within it, is simply not to have anything there. But that's not possible. You have to put something in it. So the idea there was to establish very strict guidelines, but really give it a category by itself, which is to say that we know you're going to have to change things in here. We're going to give you a menu and a palette for how to do that, and hopefully, you know, as things need to change over time, you can continue to adapt this palette to the best needs of the building. So here then, first of all, these are the windowless spaces, so these became the back of house spaces for the Center for Neuroscience. In the old building, the way it was used before, this is where they kept the animals and that sort of thing. Then you have the open space, the idea that this is where the principal investigators' offices and the workstations are, but it's all laid out in a much more open fashion. And then this is a very important point. That corner bay, which you see there in yellow, is too big by the University of Pennsylvania standards for an office. But that is, in fact, what that bay wants to be from a structural standpoint, because that's where the structure overhead aligns. So it was very important that we find a way to make these floors more efficient. And the way that we do that is, where'd it go? Okay. Is to create the three corner offices here, 1, 2, 3, but then by distorting off the grid, which I'll get to in a second, we were able to fit 3 offices in here, and then we're able to always leave one corner open to democratize the light and the views, to develop this so that you always get a sense of the great open floor plate that Kahn always wanted in this building. So you're able to increase the workstation density, put a lot more people in an open plan out on the floor. That's again just accommodating more testing rooms into the service tower. and then finally looking at how one then takes and moves off the grid in order to make this work. So what we're doing here is, you see the blue lines are the lines that you would normally follow, and we've offset by about 2 feet in each of these cases, these areas, and created a window within the window right here. This condition is that condition. It's sort of, you can't really see it, but there's a piece of glass inside the other glass. So in order to borrow light, it's a little tortured, but it actually works very well, and it does all of a sudden where you only had one office and a very dark workstation, you now have 2 very well lit, very bright offices and a much more efficient plan, which makes our client very happy. All of a sudden it increases the asset value of this building to them because they can put more people in it, they can use it much more efficiently than they've ever been able to before. And we found a way to do this in keeping with Kahn's spirit and and also looking at precedent for the offsetting partitions. Here you see, this is the famous Kimball Art Museum in Texas, and there's a precedent here. Here's the structural line, but Kahn, he just sort of uses these, again, the same bent stainless steel plate, he loves it, he uses it everywhere, to be able to move the partitions off with the same idea in mind, that you're creating an interstitial space here. You're actually creating a small gallery within the structure by just pushing these walls out slightly on either side. Also, though, as we're starting to develop this, we were looking very hard at Kahn's material palette, not only in this building but in all of his buildings, because it's remarkably consistent from building to building. So we felt that by even looking at buildings like the Yale Center for British Art here, the idea of the exposed systems, the raw concrete, the oak and glass, that this was a palette that we felt comfortable bringing back into the interiors of Richards. And there you see, that's the result before it is furnished. So you have these the offsets here, the ceiling offset. There's the line of structure, and there are these acoustic panels. And again, Kahn actually developed just that detail using a different material, but it was asbestos, so we couldn't obviously use an asbestos panel. But we interpreted that with an acoustic matte finish acoustic metal panel, which looks the same as the asbestos panel, and be able to push that aside, which gives you now not only the better use of the offices, but creates a wide enough space in here to be able to populate this with workstations, and always has the corner with the view out. And then overhead we have the systems, which I'll get to in a second, which we sort of reintroduced and reorganized, redid the lighting according to Kahn's original scheme, but now we were able to make it work better because we're using LED sources. We're able to get a much higher quality and better light with far less energy use. So here is now this was an extremely tricky exercise because we had to bring in these new systems while keeping other parts of the building operating at the same time. So there was this dance of construction phasing that means that you can't just take out everything and put everything back anew. You have to leave parts of the building intact, and you have to work around it, and then you have to come back and take the first parts out and fill in behind it. So it's not the best way to be able to realize what you want to be a very beautiful system of engineering services, but it does work, and we made it work, and with the help of the kind of tools that we have today, like this Navisworks drawing, we were able to work very closely, not only in the design team, but with the mechanical contractor who was going to build this to make sure that all of this was going to work out the way that we needed it to. And we memorialized this as part of our design and preservation guidelines. We took that diagram that I showed you of Kahn's and the working drawings before, and sort of showed people exactly what is meant to do here, what kinds of systems then can go in on the floor. So all of this is memorialized as kind of a maintenance manual going forward. So as they continue to do work on the building in the future, they have a touchstone to come back to. Energy frugality was the way in which the University of Pennsylvania in the end decided that they wanted us to approach this building. So We are optimizing the energy use. We're making it as sustainable as possible in that sense. But as I said, we're leaving single glazing, albeit laminated. We are leaving the thermally unbroken frames, but we are being very aggressive with the mechanical systems, going to a chill beam system, which now that we've got a better enclosure, now that we have just enough from the quality of the glass and the fact that the seals are back in place and there's no longer leakage, you're able to go to a much more efficient HVAC system. So we're able, what this diagram shows you is that if going from 0, which is where we began, and if you call this 100%, we're able to get to about 80%. And we feel that that's a reasonable compromise, to be able to do 80% of what would be possible in terms of the creating the most energy efficient building possible. And actually, we may be doing better than this. This was a model that was done prior to the building going into operation. There's certain evidence that things may actually be working a little better than this. So here then are some more of the spaces. Believe it or not, this is one of the great character-defining spaces in the building. And the hard part about this was making it as clean as it is. When we got the job, I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of it, but it was completely cluttered with pipes and conduits and all kinds of stuff. And the effort that went into taking that out was quite monumental. And people were concerned when they were saying, well, it's just concrete. But an amazing thing happened. We went in and we did this, and we cleaned the concrete very simply, just washed it down a couple times with a very, very lightweight, light gauge restoration cleaner. No acids, nothing aggressive, just a simple wash. And all of a sudden the concrete glowed, and there is this wonderful quality about it, and I will call it patina. I mean, people don't talk about concrete getting a patina, but certainly the process of carbonation does warm up the color, and but there's also the usage over the years, the things that really are embedded in there that wouldn't come out with the cleaning. They add quality. They add a level of experience and human memory to this as you're walking through this, to imagine the things that have happened in this building over the years, and it's really quite a wonderful experience. This piece that we added here, this is kind of a little piece of interpretive design. We found a sketch in the working drawings from Kahn that indicated that he wanted to have a shroud like that in that location. It was never detailed, it was never put in, you can call it conjectural, but because of the change of use of this space, this used to be just a corridor, and in fact wasn't even this deep. There used to be a closet that came out to that line right there, so it was just really a passage to get you in. We were able, in taking the closet away, to create enough room here for a lounge, for a reception area. So it has a little bit more formality. So we felt in this case it would be worthwhile to then put this shroud, which by the way is just perforated metal. So you can, when you're sitting under it, you can look up through it and see the system. So it's not like we're trying to completely disguise them. We're just giving it a datum, and more importantly, we are providing a place in which to put some light fixtures so that you can light the space properly. So it's actually, I think it works very well. In the entry, we did very little. Again, just clean up the concrete, rehang the doors, reset the hardware, and we were able to keep that very simple and kind of walk away. And then there is now that same space, the same typical laboratory space, furnished as they are now in use. So, a little bit of a summary here about this one. That's good. Yeah, just have the right amount of time to move on to Saarinen. I'll read this for you for the benefit of those whose English may not be that great. The successful adaptability of modern architecture is fundamentally about the appropriate reconciliation of conservation and invention. The Richards case study is a classic example of an internationally significant structure whose dysfunctionality from the day it opened had only accelerated in 55 years. Adaptation has enabled it to realize its potential as architecture, heritage, and as a working, economically viable resource. This has been possible only through the right balance of scholarship, analysis, design, and technical innovation. Our methodology, which has broad application, uses this synthesis to enable flexibility in generating the critical dialogue necessary to design a solution that builds upon an enhanced creative and disciplined interpretation of the building's generative principles. So, With that, I'll take a breath, and we will move to Cambridge, to the MIT campus, and the restoration that we just completed this past year of the two buildings there by Eero Saarinen, the Kresge Auditorium, as you see here, and the MIT Chapel. And unlike Richard's, this is a little bit more towards, I won't say it's a pure restoration, there's no such thing as a pure restoration, as I think Bill told you is the case, but these are closer to a restoration because there was not a mandate here for programmatic change. It was really a matter of solving a myriad of technical issues and just sort of cleaning things up and making them function a little bit better, but also, and you know, accommodating code upgrades, energy upgrades, that sort of thing. But I should say for both of these projects, because Bill made reference to the sort of the stakeholders and sort of the process of outreach that inevitably goes on with a project like this. With all of these projects that I've touched on, the United Nations, the Richards Laboratories, and now these, we built a broad cohort of stakeholders, advisors, peer reviewers, people who we could consult with and check with to make sure that we were not going astray. And the client was always amenable to this, to sort of to say, yes, it's very important. These are world famous buildings. We don't want to treat them in a cavalier fashion. And therefore, it is, you know, we are sort of taking the measure of the preservation community and the world architecture community as the work moves forward. So this is the auditorium and chapel as it existed when they were complete in 1955, with the trees still small. And there is Eero Saarinen, who unfortunately died quite young in 1961, but he was really one of the most prolific American architects of the mid-20th century and had an incredibly wide range. For those of you who may not be familiar, he did things like the St. Louis Arch, the TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport, hockey rink at Yale University, and on a domestic scale, this amazing house for Irwin Miller at in Columbus, Indiana. So this is a small sampling of the variety of what Saarinen did. Incredibly prolific for someone who really only had less than 20 good years of practice in him. So MIT, coming to MIT, this is a place that has been very near and dear to me over the years. I've done a number of projects there, including the restoration of this, which is their main entrance right in here. And I show you this slide because just to talk about the introduction of modern architecture at MIT and how important Saarinen's role was in sort of bringing MIT fully into the modern era. So this is 1938. Now, at the same time, also in 1938, Alvar Aalto visits MIT, and MIT undertakes their first modern building, which is the alumni pool, finished a year later. So it's important to remember the buildings I showed you before were begun in 1916, and it just took them 22 years to build it all out, so it's finished in 1938. But already at that time, they have very much embraced European modernism, and they have commissioned one of their own architects to do this first, the alumni pool, which is really the first freestanding modern building on an American institutional campus, 1938-39. Aalto, as I mentioned, also came to teach briefly at MIT. Then he went back to Finland for the Winter War and then stayed for the duration of World War II. But he came back in 1946 and was given the commission to design Baker House, which is right here, and the building that I just showed you, the neoclassical building, that's right here. So it has a relationship back. I spent a number of years working on the renovation of this building. That's a whole separate lecture. It's one that I just gave in Finland, perhaps some other time. But I want to sort of set that up because at the same time, this is setting up a precinct for student life, for the development of a student culture and residence life which had never existed at MIT before. And the next thing to happen after the construction of Baker House, which is a residence hall, was Kresge Auditorium right here, and the chapel, was the commission of Saarinen, who of course was a friend of Aalto's, a fellow Finn, and I think there was a very, very strong desire on the part of Dean William Worcester and then Pietro Beluschi, who followed him, to sort of continue this wonderful humanist modernist tradition, because Aalto, of course, is seen as the great apostle of humanism within the modern movement. And they saw Saarinen as sort of being someone who could be bold but continue the same kind of message in his work. So let's start with the MIT chapel. The chapel is it's an ecumenical structure. It's an amazing, it's small but very precious building, and every religion uses it. I mean, including the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Jews, the Catholics, the Protestants, everyone. So they share it, and it's a marvelous testimony to what a spiritual space, to what the qualities of a spiritual space that can be translated from one religion to another, that aren't necessarily particular to one kind of way of belief. There's kind of an innate humanist spirituality to the church. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with: water leakage, the problem with the roof, the window wall, which I will concentrate on, and then of course the building services. So here's the plan, and this is the sanctuary in here, which is within this cylinder. It's only top lit and lit from underneath here. And then you have this sort of lobby or narthex space that takes you into the building. We started out with the moat around the pool, which had deteriorated, and this became, in some ways, one of the most technical challenging. But also, from a preservation standpoint, we realized that in order to be able to repair this concrete to anything like what it was in its original form, we really had to take everything out, which we did, and we were able at this point also to waterproof it, to create a wonderful a fountain experience within this, but to do this in such a way that ensured that that you weren't going to be getting water into the building. And here is some of that work underway. And the issue really here, it was not that difficult technically. The issue here was matching the concrete, was finding, working with the conservators to make sure that we really were able to replicate the final finish that Saarinen used on the original building. There were some structural issues here. You can see that these arches are very deeply cut out. And they were, we had to actually work reinforcement, sort of push reinforcement back into that, and then remortar that in a way that presented a fair amount of technical difficulty in order to get that done. And then in its restored state, it has a fountain which slowly circulates the water to prevent the growth of algae. Little subtle technical things that weren't available in Saarinen's day that make it work much better. And then the space inside, here is a space at night with an overhead light coming down, and I say it's at night because you see that you don't see any light coming from this side. But then when you go during the day, there's this light that reflects off of the water and up through these windows, which are concealed at the bottom of the brick arches, and enable light to come into the space, creating a very magical effect. Within this sanctuary, all we really needed to do was clean the brick and we had art conservators work on this Richard Lippold, Harry Bertoia screen. And there were services, which I'll show you in a minute, that we had to run in to the building that hadn't been there before, and finding a way to do that was not easy. It's an ingenious system. These walls the brickwork is open here for both the distribution of air and for acoustic dampening, and it gives it a slightly otherworldly quality, which is of course appropriate for a spiritual space like this. The bell tower is also a work of art by Theodore Rozak. MIT has a group of in-house art conservators as part of the List Center. We work with them on the conservation both of the sculpture inside, but also on moving this. And this was we had an incredible day of having to lift this up with a crane, take it off the roof in order to be able to redo the roof and then lift it up so that water problems, because this had previously been causing leakage into the building because of the way in which the the way in which that was set. So we had to move it up about 8 inches in order to solve that problem. And there you see that's an original photo when they were first lifting it up into place. There you see the prospect of the tower on the building. And this is supposed to be a video, but I couldn't get it to work. But it shows it just being brought over and dropped to the ground. Suffice to say, you get the sense of what happened there. Now, on the window walls, we have in some ways an analogous situation here to what we did at Richards. The difference being that the steel window walls here are carbon steel. They were highly corroded, and we were not really able to conserve you can see by looking at some of these, we were not really able to conserve these elements. So the decision was made instead to conserve the glass. We took all the glass out, and we came up with a revised detail, similar in many ways to what we did at Richards, where this is art glass. This is a German art glass. And we found we discovered that by taking the seeded colored art glass and laminating it to a similar weighty patterned glass, a similar art glass made by the same German manufacturer with a gel laminate interlayer. So because the panes are uneven, you can't use the kind of sheet vinyl interlayer that you would normally use in laminated glass, but a special gel was developed that you can inject into that so it fills all of the voids, and you really can't tell that it's a laminated light. It still just looks like the seeded leaded art glass that it was to begin with. But you can see the difference. It just gets a little thicker, basically very, very little difference. The only thing that we did do here, though, is we took that existing frame, and when we put it back, we put it back in stainless steel so that we would not have the corrosion problems. Here again, the decision being to treat this as a work of art, to say that we're going to be energy frugal, but we're not going to optimize it. We're not going to try to put an insulating glass. We're not going to try to make a thermally broken frame. But as an exercise in trying to make a stained glass wall more robust, it's a very good exercise, because there were safety issues with this too. People were breaking it because it was very fragile, and that is no longer an issue now that it's laminated. So here is that work in process and the finished product, looking down the way into the sanctuary. The other thing we did was there was a lot of because of the corrosion of the window walls at the base. Now, let me see if I can go back and find one of those pictures. You don't really see it. Okay, I'm sorry. But the issue being that a lot of the travertine had to come out at the edges and be replaced, and we were able to source where the travertine had come from originally. We were able to find more of the same stock and be able to replace it in kind so that you really can't tell that, that these pieces were new. And we also, through paint research, discovered that it had really been a much more kind of a mauve-brown color, so we powder-coated the stainless steel, and we now really have restored what Saarinen's vision is. And then finally, on the inside, I mentioned running the upgrades for code and fire protection. If you look closely, you can just see these pipes snaking up the back wall, and they come up above the ceiling in order to provide sprinkler, fire protection, and also this line here is a little higher than it was before in order to provide fall protection for the organ. These are things that are mandated not just by the code, because the code will let you sometimes get away with this on a historic property, and the Cambridge Historical Commission was perfectly willing to give us a buy on this, but MIT's insurance said no. We are upgrading this building. We're going to make it as safe as possible. We have too many liability issues to enable it to be any other way. And we agree with that. I mean, my philosophy, I've been doing this now for 25 years with buildings like this. I think that's the right thing to do, and you just find a way to accommodate it as best as possible. So now at the auditorium, this is an incredible thin shell structure. At the very top, it's about 3 inches, which is about 8 centimeters thick at this top. It's a very, very minimal dome. It's thinner proportionally than an eggshell. So that gives you an idea of how lightweight this structure is. And it is shown here with its original roof, which was a membrane. Saarinen originally wanted it to be a copper shingle roof. He couldn't get that to work, and it has had a history of roofs over the years, going from this to lead to and finally to the copper roof that is there today. But it's an interesting evolution, because one of the questions that came up when we began the work is, do you go back and do you try to do this? They said, well, maybe this is not what Saarinen wanted, but it is historically. This was the original roof. This is what the historical record shows the building had on it. It didn't work. We basically, I think there was a very good argument that that roof was put there in haste as a stopgap, because they had to do something, because the roof that they had designed simply wasn't going to work. And it was seen as a kind of temporary measure to be finished when the right solution came along. Here's the dome under construction. It's quite an amazing piece of work. And I want to show you this because here's a section through the auditorium, because one of the things that we were dealing with here, as we did at Richards, is the idea of that these buildings move, and especially this lightweight construction that's really pushing the envelope on where structure goes. There's a lot that happens here, so that you see there's a deformation that will occur in the dome, because you get forces pushing out like this and pushing in like that. And there's a detail, which unfortunately I don't have a photo of this joint right here, which is drawn to double scale, twice actual size, of these neoprene gaskets that are designed so that the curtain wall and the roof can do this with one another, that there can be a lot of differential movement without that leaking. So the original curtain wall that was put in was an aluminum system, and like so many curtain walls of the 1950s, they kind of made it up as they went along. It was seriously technically flawed from the beginning, but given the fact that this building is nothing but 3 curtain walls and a roof, it's obviously a highly primary character defining feature, and so we had to come up with a way to keep this building essentially looking like this, but with a much more robust system. So here to give you some idea of the condition, there you see the sort of typical piece of the framing coming to the ground. This is all the steel is corroded out there. All of this is all failed along the bottom here. And then on the inside, you're starting to get the same kinds of failure, but they had also put this very unfortunate coating on the brick, which is something that we had to remove later on. But part of that reason was to stop moisture infiltration. So on the left, this is the original framing for the curtain wall. You see, it's a very naive system. It's really, you have an angle here and an angle here, and you have a gap. So what you're essentially relying here on simply the pressure from this screw and all of that sealant to keep water out of the building. Not a very not a system that engenders a lot of confidence in terms of keeping water out of the building, and in fact it didn't keep water out of the building very well. So what we came up with, but that profile, that sort of hat channel shaped profile, was absolutely critical in making in the aesthetic of the building. So we developed a much more robust detail, and again, once again, going from single pane to laminated glass. Here's the laminated glass. In this case, going from an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch, so because they were smaller lights to begin with. But again, we did the same exploration of testing an IGU and all of that. It simply wasn't going to work. And frankly, given the fact that most of the building use here is within the auditorium, which is a building within the building, the tempering of the lobby space was not that critical, and they don't actually, it isn't actually that big a burden on the HVAC system. So we working with a design assist contractor, and here again, as we did at Richards, we brought on builders early to help us to develop these details, because as much as we know and would like to tell people what to do, we are not the people in the field putting these things in place, and we want to make sure that they are comfortable, that they have both the capacity in their shops to be able to fabricate these elements and then to bring them to the field and put them on the building properly. So here's the construction in process. At the base of the dome, there was a lot of corrosion because all of the water comes off at these 3 points, and all along the kind of leading edge, this as it goes up, there was a concrete restoration that we had to do, but only really at that edge, and then this was completely rebuilt. We had to sort of take this apart. You see, take it down, redo the drains, and then here, completely strip the concrete off, put in new reinforcement, and then put that back together again. We also just did a little bit of the roof. The roof in the 1980s had finally been changed to a copper roof. Let me get you to that picture. There it is. And this we basically, by common agreement, this roof, which was actually, the concept for that came from a vice president at MIT, the vice president who was in charge of facilities, who was tired of 20 years of trying to fix the roof on the building. He sat in a meeting one day and did a sketch, and he said, why don't we do something like this? And it was worked up into a design, and this now has, so there's an interesting, besides the fact that it works technically and that everybody feels it looks pretty good on the building, there's an interesting cultural aspect of this, the idea that, a frustrated client says, you know what, I've got a better idea, I can really make this work in a way that it hasn't worked before. It becomes part of the story of the building, becomes part of the history, part of its lore. And it has held up remarkably well. The only failure that we had there was just because of a lot of the seams along the back here and at the very, very top were starting to come loose. So we decided in the end to just redo that. This had become, it is such a hot point for all of the water and snow and whatnot coming down that we felt it was best to just accept the fact that we're going to redo that. There was also a question though, do you say, well, all right, now you've got this brown copper, it's going to take a long, long time before it turns the same patina as the rest of the roof. Do you artificially patina it? And we decided no. Let's be honest about this. This is a repair that needs to be made. It's made very well. It's the same at all the 3 corners, so it doesn't look accidental, and it will weather in its own time. I mentioned that we stripped this horrible brick coating off of the floor, but we also had to completely redo the plaza, and this was both for a technical reason, but also for code. The kinds of brick that had been used originally no longer met the accessibility codes. This is a very strict new regulation, and we actually had to put in something that was a much tighter fit and a flatter brick. So it's a little bit of a change of character there. You're finding this everywhere. One of the big ones in Boston is Boston City Hall Plaza, which has acres and acres and acres of that older brick, which is really the character definition of it. And they're having to go back with this other brick simply because it is considered a hazard. And this is an interesting debate. I won't go into it here. I think here we were able to match it close enough. We spent a lot of time picking bricks, and it's extremely close. But the difference is that it no longer has this mortar joint pattern that it had before. These are much tighter joints, and you can tell the difference as you look at it. On the inside, again, we had to run services through the auditorium and make it accessible. So there were changes made down in the front here. We had to remove some seats. We hit a lift behind the back to sort of get up to the stage. And then you can see these lines on the ceiling, if you look closely, and that's the process of putting in these fire protection. We actually got the contractor, in this case, to scribe with an arc, the pipe, to actually curve the pipe so that it scribes to the dome, so that it is as little intrusive as possible in providing sprinklers for the space. And that's it. And we're on time.
Well, thank you very much, David. It was a very interesting and in-depth presentation of a couple of projects. I guess there must be questions about these technical details, maybe, or the approach about how to conserve some of them. No one? I have a question about the glass, actually, because what we often do in France is we also try to keep the same laminated glass, or if it's in older buildings, actually mouth-blown glass, and then there's the same technique of laminating it with a coated glass on the inside, so you keep this same aspect on the outside. But I wasn't aware of what you showed in the Richard Labs, that it also has this influence on if it's straighter or not. So that
It's more elastic. Yeah, there's more flexibility in that kind of, but certainly than there would be. With an IGU, you'd be stressing the seals from day one and they wouldn't last. I was just going to say, if you're using an insulated glass unit, when you have that kind of warpage, you'd be stressing the seals, and it would inevitably, their lifespan would be shortened. Whereas with laminated glass, even more than with tempered glass, because it's not quite as hard, it gives you that slight, just the amount of flexibility that you need to be able to scribe it precisely to these areas. I mean, it's funny because it becomes, it's not a mechanized process at all. It's really a craft process. It's a handmade process after a while. Anyone else?
Yeah, we'll talk about it during the debate, and I say bon appétit.